Before Houston was ever etched on maps, before railroads, oil rigs, or the hum of freeways, there was a land shaped by water, wind, and the timeless rhythm of seasons. This was not yet a city. It was a living landscape of bayous, wetlands, and dense forests. The story of Houston begins not with settlers, but with the native peoples who walked, fished, hunted, and sang through this region long before European empires cast their eyes across the Atlantic. The land now known as southeastern Texas was home to an intricate web of indigenous cultures for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence suggests human presence here for over 10,000 years. In the area that would one day cradle Houston's urban sprawl, people thrived near the coastlines, rivers, and wooded expanses, adapting with an intelligence forged over generations. Among the earliest inhabitants were the Karankawa, Akakiza, and Atakapa, names not widely remembered by those who now traverse the city's highways, but whose presence shaped the earliest chapters of this place. These were not monolithic societies, but complex cultures with language, rituals, spiritual systems, and deeply rooted ties to the land. The Akakiza, for instance, are often associated with the regions surrounding present-day Harris County and the Bayou systems that form the city's watery spine. They moved with the seasons, building temporary structures called wickiups near water during warmer months and retreating inland during the winter. They relied on hunting deer, fishing with nets and traps, and gathering wild plants and roots. Their diet included shellfish from the Gulf, berries from the woods, and roots harvested from the muddy banks of creeks. Their canoes, often fashioned from hollowed logs, were vessels of survival and ceremony, sliding silently through the Bayous long before Houston's ships and barges. Ceremonies, music, and oral storytelling marked the rhythm of life. The stars above these southern skies guided not just their movements but their myths. Children learned by doing, taught through repetition and legend. Spiritual beliefs centered around nature's cycles, thunderstorms, droughts, animal migrations. Ancestors were remembered, and the land was never just territory, it was kin. The indigenous peoples here were part of broader trade and migration networks that extended across the continent. Artifacts found near Buffalo Bayou show signs of long-distance exchange. Flint from inland quarries, shells from distant coasts, pottery whose designs echo symbols seen hundreds of miles away. These were not isolated bands, but nodes in an expansive cultural tapestry that predated maps. Communities lived with the land, not against it. The wet, subtropical climate dictated the tempo of life. Rains nourished the soil but flooded lowlands. Hurricanes, though rare in oral record, occasionally swept across the Gulf. The people adapted, not with defiance, but with wisdom. Homes could be quickly disassembled. Canoes became lifelines. Seasonal migrations ensured sustainability. Though the Akakiza and related groups lacked permanent monumental architecture like the great cities of the Aztec or Maya, they held a different grandeur, a mastery of adaptation and resilience. Their social structures, while less hierarchical, centered on shared resources, clan alliances, and mutual stewardship. Leadership rotated with context: war, peace, ritual. Elders guided, shamans interpreted, and councils deliberated beneath ancient trees. Tools were fashioned from what the land offered. Bone awls, shell beads, wooden clubs, and stone scrapers, each was a testament to ingenuity. The presence of mounds and burial sites, though fewer in number than in other regions, hints at ceremonial practices, possibly involving seasonal gatherings, trade, or rites of passage. Children would grow up steeped in story. Tales of creation, morality, and survival echoed at night around communal fires. The cry of a heron, the flash of a lightning bug, the silence before a storm, all held meaning. Naming, dreaming, and dancing were not entertainment but connection to cosmos, community, and continuity. But the winds of time were shifting. By the 1500s, change would come from across the sea, borne not on clouds but on sails. European exploration began to reach the Gulf Coast. Though initial contact was sporadic, disease often arrived before ships did. The indigenous populations, with no immunity to smallpox, measles, and influenza, began to suffer catastrophic losses even before direct confrontation. When Spanish explorers like Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca traversed the region in the 16th century, they encountered a world already strained. He described coastal groups that were wary, fragmented, and wary of strangers. His accounts, while filtered through European perception, provide some of the earliest recorded references to native groups in the Houston region. European cartographers began sketching maps of terra incognita, filling vast blanks with the names of people they never met. The Acoquisa and Atacapa became figures in footnotes, their cultures recorded through the distorted lens of conquerors and missionaries. But the maps also show something else: the rivers, the bayous, the coasts. The land remained silent witness to upheaval. By the time missions and military expeditions followed, the indigenous landscape had begun to unravel under the weight of colonial expansion. Disease, forced labor, assimilation policies, and warfare diminished populations. The Acoquisa, once stewards of the land that would become Houston, faded from written records by the 1800s, absorbed into other tribes, displaced westward, or simply gone. Yet they left traces. Beneath layers of development, under parking lots and golf courses, in the banks of creeks and protected preserves, their tools, hearths, and bones remain. Some place names still echo their presence, and in modern descendants and historians, their story continues to be reclaimed, remembered, and retold. Contemporary scholars, tribal members, and archaeologists now work to reconstruct and honor the lives that flourished before colonization. Museum collections and academic studies piece together fragments of pottery, of bone, of story. Exhibitions highlight native life not as a footnote, but as a foundational chapter. Schools slowly begin to teach more inclusive histories. Today's Houston rests on ancestral ground. Each glimmering tower, each stretch of freeway, each curve of the Bayou overlays a past too often erased but never truly lost. The story of Houston does not begin with its founding. It begins in the rhythm of the land, in the footsteps of those who lived in harmony with the Bayous, and in the silent legacy of a people who called this place home. Before concrete, before cattle, before commerce, there was the earth, the water, and the people who moved through both like wind in the grass. The pre-colonial history of Houston is a whisper under the roar of the modern city. But if you listen closely, in the quiet between sirens and traffic, you can still hear it. In the cry of birds over the Buffalo Bayou, in the hush of oaks at twilight, in the subtle bend of the river, following a path etched by memory. This was their world first, and it still remembers them. In the long, humid stretch of coastal plain, where the land whispers of water and the skies roll with distant thunder, a new force arrived in the 16th century, curious, powerful, and utterly alien. The Spanish came not with respect for the intricate societies they found, but with banners and crosses, armor and muskets, driven by imperial ambition, religious zeal, and the glittering promise of gold. Their arrival in the Gulf region would forever alter the delicate balance of life that had thrived for centuries. Though they never established a major colonial city within the bounds of modern Houston, the Spaniards' presence was felt through every mile of surrounding forest, prairie, and bayou. Their arrival marked the beginning of a centuries-long disruption, the first great wave of external encroachment that would fracture the lifeways of indigenous peoples and set the foundations for colonial and, later, American domination. The Spanish era in Texas, including the area that would become Houston, was defined more by ambition than success. Unlike other parts of New Spain, such as Mexico City or Florida's Street Augustine, this region remained wild and stubborn. Spanish conquistadors, missionaries, and settlers viewed East Texas as a place of potential, a frontier to be subdued and converted, but were met with resistance from the land, climate, and its people. The Gulf Coast was first sighted by Europeans in the early 1500s. Ulvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca's shipwreck in 1528 along the Texas coast brought one of the earliest Spanish perspectives of the native cultures. He wandered for 8 years across the region, including what is now southeastern Texas. His accounts speak of small bands of people, generous yet wary, their populations already thinned by diseases that swept in like invisible fire ahead of European steps. Throughout the 1500s and 1600s, the Spanish made sporadic attempts to assert influence along the Gulf, though their attention often turned elsewhere, to the mineral-rich interiors of Mexico, to California, or to missions in central Texas. Still, they kept returning to the coast, hoping to secure their empire's edge against French encroachment and to Christianize the native peoples. The most enduring legacy of Spanish engagement was the mission system. Throughout Texas, missions were tools of both religion and colonization. Though most were concentrated in San Antonio and along the Rio Grande, their effects radiated outward. Native groups from the Houston area were sometimes captured or coerced into these missions. Some were baptized and resettled far from their ancestral lands. Others resisted, fleeing deeper into forests or merging with other tribal groups to preserve cultural identities. Spanish colonization was not merely a conquest of arms. It was also one of language, labor, and belief. Priests, often Franciscan friars, saw themselves as saviors of souls. Their world was binary, heathen or saved. In their zeal, they erased traditions, suppressed native languages, and tore apart kinship structures. Children were taken into mission schools, taught Castilian, and instructed in Catholic doctrine. Entire villages dissolved as populations were drawn away or wiped out by foreign diseases. Still, the Bayou country resisted. The dense, mosquito-laced woods and marshes around future Houston made permanent Spanish settlements difficult. There were no rich silver mines to exploit, no grand cities to conquer. The land here whispered differently than the highlands of Mexico. It demanded humility. And so, while Spanish flags were raised in distant presidios, the people of this watery world endured with a quiet defiance. By the 1700s, competition from other European powers spurred greater Spanish attention. The French, pushing westward from Louisiana, made claims on East Texas. Their traders ventured near the Red River and sometimes into the Brazos and Trinity watersheds. Spain responded by increasing their military and missionary presence. Presidios, military outposts, were established to guard frontier lines. Expeditions were sent to chart, map, and control. One such effort led to the establishment of San Antonio de Baxa in 1718, now the heart of San Antonio. Though far west of modern Houston, its creation signaled a renewed Spanish commitment to holding Texas. From these outposts, officials issued edicts, priests recruited converts, and settlers pushed into new territories. Occasionally, explorers ventured toward the east, surveying the dense wilderness between the Brazos and Trinity rivers, the zone where Houston would one day rise. Native peoples continued to face increasing pressures. Those who refused mission life found themselves caught between colonial empires. Raids and counter-raids, shifting alliances, and cultural erosion defined the 1700s. Some tribes aligned with the Spanish to gain protection from rivals or to access European goods, guns, cloth, metal tools. Others turned to the French. Some simply disappeared into the thickening fog of history, their names surviving only in maps and mission records. The Spanish brought cattle and horses, inadvertently transforming the ecology. Feral herds spread. Plains once filled with deer and bison became grazing grounds. With livestock came new kinds of land use, fencing, branding, overgrazing. Nomadic and semi-sedentary native groups found their foodways disrupted. Seasonal hunting patterns were blocked. Rivers were claimed. Old trails became guarded roads. Language began to shift. Spanish words entered native dialects. Place names were redrawn. Rio San Jacinto, Rio de los Brazos de Dios. The map, a colonial artifact, spread like a net across the land. Yet, despite this growing pressure, Houston's precise location remained untouched by formal Spanish settlement. It was too swampy, too distant, too difficult. The missions remained to the west. The presidios stayed farther north or south. Houston's land was in a shadow zone, watched, sometimes crossed, but not fully claimed. This very neglect may have helped preserve elements of native life longer here than elsewhere. But time was not on their side. By the end of the 1700s, the Spanish grip on Texas weakened. The empire was stretched thin. Revolutions loomed. And in the east, a new power, Anglo-American settlers, began to arrive. They came first as traders, then as colonists, and eventually as revolutionaries. The age of missions and empires was drawing to a close, but its consequences, displacement, disease, and cultural transformation would reverberate for generations. When future Houstonians dug canals or built railroads, they unearthed bones. When bayou banks eroded after a storm, they revealed arrowheads, pottery shards, and stone tools. These fragments whispered of lives lived long before sprawl and skyline. Spanish colonization left fewer visible marks in Houston than in other parts of Texas, but its legacy remained in erased languages, in vanished villages, in altered landscapes. The empire passed through like a storm, leaving silence and shadows behind. And still, the Bayous flowed. As the 18th century unfolded, the world beyond the Gulf shifted. Spanish imperial power, once dominant in the Americas, faced both internal strains and growing threats from other European rivals. For the land that would one day bear the name Houston, this era was one of transformation, not through direct conquest, but through encroachment, slow settlement, and the steady erosion of indigenous sovereignty. This chapter of Houston's story is not yet a tale of cities and borders, but of trails worn into soil by moccasins and boots, of canoes that gave way to wagons, of missionaries calling from the west and traders arriving from the east. It is a story of contact, contest, and change, a liminal space where empires brushed against one another and against the people who had called this place home for generations. By the early 1700s, the Spanish had established a firmer presence in Texas, largely anchored around San Antonio and along the Rio Grande. Their missions and presidios were growing nodes in a vast, sparsely populated landscape. But the coastal plains of the southeast, where the Bayous snaked and the air hung heavy with humidity, remained largely unsettled by Europeans. This was still frontier land. Into this space came traders. Some were French, moving westward from Louisiana. Others were Spanish, venturing east from San Antonio or north from Nacogdoches. They followed river routes and native trails, crossing lands where the Acoquisa and Atacapa still hunted and fished. Trade goods flowed in every direction: metal tools, firearms, cloth, beads, salt, and horses. In return came pelts, dried meats, native crafted items, and knowledge of terrain. French trappers, unlike many of their Spanish counterparts, often married into native families and learned local languages. Their integration, however partial, made them more trusted by indigenous groups. For years, this uneasy balance held: European goods without full-scale settlement, contact without colonization. But history rarely allows for equilibrium. As missions expanded west of the Trinity River, pressure grew on native communities in the east. The Spanish mission system, while limited in reach here, still sought to gather indigenous peoples into centralized locations for conversion and control. Missionaries traveled in small parties, preaching salvation in Spanish and Latin to people who spoke completely different tongues. A few accepted baptism, whether from belief, coercion, or survival, but many fled deeper into the woods, choosing freedom over compliance. Some groups attempted to adapt. They incorporated horses into their hunting practices. They used European weapons in traditional intertribal conflicts. Others resisted violently. There were skirmishes, ambushes, retaliations. Some native bands relocated entirely, moving west or north. Those who remained found their world increasingly circumscribed, not by walls, but by paths they could no longer walk freely. The period also saw increased interaction with Anglo-American settlers. Though formal Anglo-colonization of Texas would not begin until after 1820, individuals began to drift westward from the U.S. frontier. They came as hunters, outlaws, and opportunists. Some sought land, others profit. These early arrivals often ignored Spanish authority, settling where they pleased, cutting timber, trapping game, and sometimes clashing with local officials. One such route into Texas was the old San Antonio Road, or El Camino Real de los Tejas, a rough artery that linked Spanish Louisiana to the interior. Traders, soldiers, and settlers all passed along its path, carving new trails off its spine. Some of these routes would eventually become roads in and around Houston. The land was being mapped not just on paper, but through footsteps and wheels. Even as European and American powers maneuvered, nature remained a formidable presence. Hurricanes lashed the coast, swelling the Bayous. Summers baked the plains. Disease continued to claim lives. Settlers battled not just native resistance, but the very environment they hoped to tame. Still, the allure of land was irresistible. The coastal prairie offered fertile soil for those who could clear it. Its rivers promised water, transport, and trade. The Trinity and Brazos were lifelines, and between them, nestled in a watery wedge of dense forest and open grassland, lay the future site of Houston. By the late 1700s, the Spanish grip on Texas was weakening. Internal revolts in Mexico hinted at deeper unrest. Meanwhile, the United States expanded rapidly. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, American territory now bordered Spanish Texas directly. Suddenly, the boundary between empires ran uncomfortably close to the Bayous. American filibusters, unauthorized military adventurers, began testing the borderlands. Some hoped to wrest Texas from Spanish control. Others merely sought to claim land for themselves. Their incursions, though scattered, added to the region's instability. In 1812, the Gutierrez Meiji expedition, an early Texan revolt against Spanish rule, passed through East Texas. Though it ultimately failed, it signaled a shift. The age of imperial competition was fading. A new age of revolution, independence, and settlement was rising. In Mexico, cries for liberation from Spain grew louder. By 1821, after a decade of struggle, Mexico achieved independence. This moment ended the Spanish colonial era and began a new chapter under Mexican governance. It would also open the door to Anglo-colonization on a scale never before seen. But before that wave arrived, Houston's lands still lay in a liminal state, touched by empire, but not yet transformed. The Bayous still flowed unchanneled. The prairies had yet to be fenced. The city remained unborn. This was the frontier's edge, where cultures collided, trade routes formed, and history gathered itself for the next great surge. When the year 1821 dawned over the grassy prairies and muddy bayous of what would one day become Houston, the region was caught in the vast shadow of imperial unraveling. After centuries of Spanish dominance, Mexico had declared its independence. The rule of the Spanish crown had come to a close, not with a thunderous collapse in Texas, but with a slow unraveling carried across deserts and mountains, filtering down through presidios, missions, and distant outposts. For the people of Tejas, Mexicans, native peoples, Anglo-American immigrants, freed and enslaved Africans, change had arrived, though not all would understand the full scale of that change for years to come. Mexican independence did not immediately transform the region. In the early years, governance remained uncertain, leadership frequently shifted, and borders were more a matter of aspiration than enforcement. East Texas, with its humid forests and fertile land, remained lightly populated and loosely controlled. Mexico's central government, now tasked with administering a vast and diverse republic, saw Texas both as an opportunity and a liability. To strengthen its hold, the Mexican government turned to colonization. In 1823, it issued an impresario policy, granting large land tracts to individuals, many of them foreigners, who could recruit settlers to the frontier. The most famous of these was Stephen F. Austin, who established the first significant Anglo-American colony in Texas. Though his grant was farther south and east of present-day Houston, the ripple effects would soon reach the Bayous. Over the next decade, settlers from the United States poured into Texas, lured by promises of land, opportunity, and relative autonomy. Many came from the American South, bringing with them enslaved labor, Protestant faiths, and Anglo-legal customs. They built homesteads and plantations, cut trails through forests, and began farming along the fertile banks of rivers like the Brazos and the San Jacinto. In the region where Houston would rise, these settlers began to establish small communities and farms. The Bayous that had once nourished the Accoquisa people now bordered new fields and timber camps. Buffalo Bayou, in particular, became a strategic corridor, its winding path a potential artery for trade and transport. Though there was no formal city yet, the land was being quietly transformed. But tension brewed beneath the surface. Mexico, wary of losing control, passed new laws to regulate immigration and limit slavery. The law of April 6, 1830, sought to halt further Anglo-American settlement and reassert Mexican authority. It banned U.S. immigration, imposed customs duties, and restricted the importation of slaves. Settlers bristled. They viewed the law as an infringement on their rights and a threat to their livelihoods. At the same time, internal divisions within Mexico weakened its ability to enforce control. Coups and revolutions in the capital sapped attention. By the mid-1830s, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna had seized power, centralizing authority and dismantling federalist reforms. Texans, many of whom had grown used to local self-governance, saw this as tyranny. Resistance began quietly, petitions, protests, political meetings, but it soon escalated. In 1835, skirmishes erupted between Mexican troops and Texian militias. One of the earliest clashes occurred at Gonzales, where settlers resisted the retrieval of a small cannon with the now famous slogan, "Come and take it." From that spark, revolution ignited. The Texian Rebellion, what would become the Texas Revolution, gathered momentum. Militias formed across East Texas. Settlers rallied to defend what they saw as their rights and their land. In early 1836, a convention was held at Washington on the Brazos, where delegates declared independence from Mexico and drafted a new constitution. Texas, they claimed, was now a sovereign republic. But Mexico did not let go easily. Santa Anna marched north with a sizable army, intent on crushing the rebellion. Battles flared, some famous, some forgotten. The Alamo, a mission-turned fortress in San Antonio, fell after a bloody siege. Its defenders, famed figures like William B. Travis, James Bowie, and Davy Crockett, were killed to the last man. The massacre galvanized the Texian cause. In the weeks that followed, a wave of panic spread across the frontier. Known as the Runaway Scrape, settlers fled eastward before Santa Anna's advancing army. They burned crops, abandoned homes, and pushed toward the safer, swampier lands near the coast. In this exodus, some passed through the future site of Houston, camping along the Bayous, moving east toward the Trinity River. The turning point came in April 1836 at a marshy plain near the confluence of Buffalo Bayou and the San Jacinto River. There, General Sam Houston, commanding the Texian army, led a surprise attack against Santa Anna's forces. The Battle of San Jacinto lasted just 18 minutes. The Texians, shouting "Remember the Alamo" and "Remember Goliad," overwhelmed the Mexican camp. Santa Anna was captured the next day, disguised and fleeing. The victory was total. Santa Anna signed surrender terms, and his army retreated. Though Mexico would not formally recognize Texas independence for years, the practical result was clear. Texas was free. The fledgling Republic of Texas was born, and with it came a surge of ambition. In the aftermath, land speculation exploded. Investors and speculators rushed to claim tracts along bayous and rivers. Among them were two entrepreneurial brothers from New York, Augustus and John Allen. In 1836, only months after the Revolution's end, they would purchase land along Buffalo Bayou and lay out the plan for a new city. They named it Houston. Thus, the Revolution, with its pain and pride, its bloodshed and boldness, cleared the path for Houston's founding. The very Bayous that had witnessed ancient migrations, quiet trade, and the fearful flight of settlers, would now cradle a city built on ambition, commerce, and memory. The years from 1821 to 1836 were an era of upheaval. but also of birth. A nation was born, and in its wake, a city would rise. Houston, the child of rebellion, resting beside a bayou where revolution once echoed through the trees. The summer of 1836 hung heavy over the Texas coast. The war for independence had ended just months before. The Bayous ran thick and slow through the mosquito-laced forests of southeast Texas, as they had for centuries. But something was changing. Amid the mud and heat, a new venture was quietly taking shape, one that would give rise to a city born not of ancient roots or long-settled trade, but from pure ambition, paper claims, and a dream. This is where the story of Houston as a city begins. Augustus Chapman Allen and John Kirby Allen were brothers from upstate New York, merchants, land speculators, and men of calculation. They were not soldiers, but they recognized opportunity in the aftermath of revolution. Texas, newly declared a republic, was wide open. Its future capital was yet undetermined. Fortunes were waiting to be made. In August 1836, the Allens purchased 6,642 acres along Buffalo Bayou from the estate of John Austin, no relation to Stephen F. Austin, for $5,000. The land was swampy, wooded, prone to flooding, and strategically located. Buffalo Bayou, long a silent artery of indigenous life and settler survival, would now serve as the spine of a city. Within weeks, they issued advertisements announcing their new town, Houston, named in honor of San Houston, the hero of San Jacinto and President of the Republic of Texas. The name was a calculated move. By attaching their fledgling settlement to the figure who had secured Texas's freedom, the Allens ensured immediate prestige. They marketed Houston as a hub of commerce, law, and politics. Newspaper ads promised that steamboats could reach the town year-round, that the Bayou would support trade with the Gulf, and that land was available for those eager to invest in the future. Their promotional fervor knew few limits. What they lacked in urban infrastructure, they compensated for in promise. At the time of its founding, Houston had no real streets, only a rough grid drawn onto maps. No buildings, only tents and temporary cabins. The Allens offered free lots to those willing to construct homes and businesses. The town plan was laid out with wide streets named after heroes and ideals: Congress Avenue, Main Street, Liberty, and Capitol. In 1837, just 1 year after the Battle of San Jacinto, Houston was designated the temporary capital of the Republic of Texas. The decision was as much a nod to geography as to politics. The location, they argued, was central enough for trade, accessible by river, and distant enough from Mexico to avoid future attacks. With the government came lawyers, clerks, lawmakers, and a sense of legitimacy. Sam Houston himself arrived that year to take up residence in the city that bore his name. The Republic's Congress met in a makeshift structure called the Capitol. Along dusty paths, crude log cabins sprang up to house government offices, boarding houses, and saloons. The town grew quickly, if unevenly. That same year, Houston was officially incorporated. Francis Lubbock, who would later become a Confederate governor, became one of its first leaders. Newspapers like the Telegraph and Texas Register began to publish from the city, helping shape not just its news, but its identity. Still, the city faced enormous challenges. Disease stalked the swamps. Yellow fever outbreaks were frequent and deadly. The summer heat was oppressive. Streets turned to mud during rains and dust during droughts. The Bayou, though a lifeline for trade, often flooded, and competition from Galveston and other coastal towns threatened Houston's ambitions. Yet Houston persevered. Commerce flowed slowly but steadily along Buffalo Bayou. Flatboats and steamboats hauled cotton, lumber, and livestock to the coast. Merchants set up shops. Banks opened. Churches were built, first Protestant, then Catholic. Schools followed. A semblance of society began to emerge from the swamp. By 1839, the capital was relocated to Austin. It was a blow to Houston's aspirations, but not a death knell. The Allens, having accomplished their primary goal of founding and launching the city, soon withdrew. John Allen died in 1838, and Augustus moved on to other ventures. But the city they created endured. The 1840s were a decade of survival and consolidation. Houston became a center of regional trade. Its location made it a crucial stopover between plantations inland and the port at Galveston. The population grew slowly, unevenly, but with increasing permanence. More brick buildings replaced wood. More businesses planted roots. Law and order remained elusive. Crime was common, law enforcement thin. Courts convened in taverns or temporary structures. Duels were not unheard of. Politics remained intense. The Republic of Texas itself faced instability, with mounting debt and threats from Mexico. Houston, caught in this uncertainty, tried to act like a capital even after the title had moved. Yet the city's resilience was real. Behind the grand rhetoric of its founders, behind the muddy streets and shoddy structures, a civic spirit was taking shape. Houstonians began to see themselves not as residents of a speculative venture, but as citizens of a town with destiny. In 1845, Texas would be annexed by the United States, becoming the 28th state. For Houston, this marked a new era. No longer a capital, no longer a wild republic outpost. It was now a city of a state in a growing nation. And with statehood came infrastructure, immigration, and industrialization. Houston's birth was unlike most American cities. It was not a fort or a port, not a colonial capital or a riverfront hub. It was a marketing idea turned reality, a city conjured from swamp and ambition. Its founders were not frontiersmen or farmers, but businessmen who saw in geography and timing a chance to create something lasting. They succeeded. What followed would not be easy. The challenges of the coming decades, war, disease, flood, economic booms and busts, would test the city's foundation. But the vision of the Allens, drawn in ink and planted on muddy ground, had taken root. Houston, in 1845, stood ready for its next chapter. The annexation of Texas into the United States in 1845 marked a seismic shift for Houston, a young city already bustling with the noise of trade and speculation. Though only a decade old, Houston had grown from a muddy frontier town into a functioning hub of commerce, law, and regional politics. But now it found itself part of a nation at odds with itself, as disputes over slavery, statehood, and economic development foreshadowed storms on the horizon. Statehood brought federal legitimacy. With it came federal troops, U.S. mail routes, and more reliable commerce. Houston's strategic location near Buffalo Bayou and its relative proximity to Galveston gave it a unique edge in the state's growing transportation network. Though Galveston remained Texas' dominant port, Houston began to solidify its role as an inland distributor, warehouse, and administrative center. Infrastructure began to improve. Roads, once crude trails, were graded and widened. Ferries and bridges offered safer crossings over the meandering Bayous. Houston's streets remained largely unpaved and vulnerable to flooding, but the city's leaders pressed forward with civic improvements. Sidewalks, plank roads, and drainage ditches appeared. The population continued to grow. Newcomers arrived from the American South and Europe, particularly Germany and Ireland, seeking opportunity. Many were tradesmen, craftsmen, or laborers. Others brought enslaved people and plantation ambitions. Houston itself was not a center of plantation agriculture, but its economy increasingly depended on the cotton produced in surrounding counties. Cotton was king. Steamboats plied the Bayous, carrying bales of cotton from inland plantations to Galveston and beyond. Warehouses sprang up near the water's edge. Merchants set up offices. Banks offered loans backed by land and human property. Auction blocks, markets, and slave pens operated quietly but openly. The wealth of Houston and much of Texas was entangled with the institution of slavery. Despite its growth, Houston remained rough around the edges. The city's early decades were marked by crime, disease, and periodic fire. Epidemics of yellow fever swept through during the warmer months, killing hundreds. Waterborne diseases from poor sanitation were common. Fires broke out regularly among the densely packed wooden buildings, prompting the formation of early volunteer fire brigades. But these challenges did not deter ambition. Houstonians formed literary societies, churches, newspapers, and Masonic lodges. Education efforts expanded. Though segregated and limited, early schools took root. Cultural life began to stir. By the 1850s, the city boasted theaters, music halls, and public lectures. The seeds of a civic identity had been planted. The railroads arrived next. In 1853, the Buffalo Bayou, Brazos, and Colorado Railway began operations, the first in Texas. Though modest at first, the line represented the dawn of a new era. Houston's businessmen recognized the power of rail to shift trade patterns away from the unpredictable Bayous. They invested heavily. More lines followed, connecting the city to inland markets, cotton fields, and eventually to the rest of the nation. Railroads became Houston's arteries. The city's position at the junction of multiple lines transformed it from a bayou town into a transportation hub. Goods could now flow in all directions, north to Dallas, west toward Austin, east to Louisiana. Warehouses expanded, hotels opened, and investment surged. The city's skyline, still dominated by steeples and chimneys, grew denser. But as Houston grew, so did the nation's tensions. The debate over slavery escalated. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Fugitive Slave Law stirred passions across the country. And in Houston, the city's press reflected the divide. Some papers defended slavery and secession. Others urged caution, moderation, or unionist sentiment. Houston's population was divided, but the city leaned southern. The economy, culture, and political leadership were deeply tied to southern identity. Though some Houstonians opposed the spread of slavery, few openly advocated for abolition. Enslaved people labored in homes, docks, brickyards, and rail yards. Their presence was widespread, but often unspoken. Their lives documented more in ledgers than newspapers. The 1850s brought new waves of settlers, many with southern roots and pro-slavery beliefs. They brought with them money, political influence, and ambition. Houston's civic leadership included many prominent slaveholders. Elections were bitterly contested. Debates over states' rights, federal power, and sectional loyalty filled public discourse. By the end of the decade, Texas was poised on the edge of decision. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln's election ignited fears across the South. Secession conventions were called. Texas, after a brief debate, voted to leave the Union in early 1861. Houston, like much of the state, supported the move. The city prepared for war, not with jubilation, but with resolve. The Civil War would bring hardship, change, and deep scars. But in 1860, as war clouds gathered, Houston stood as a thriving, if divided, city. It was a place of promise built atop contradiction, a growing metropolis whose future was shaped by both commerce and chains. The roots of conflict, already planted in its soil, would soon blossom into a storm that no city, no state, and no nation could avoid. When Texas voted to secede from the United States in 1861, Houston was already a city in motion, a young yet ambitious town transformed by railroads, trade, and civic pride. But the storm of civil war that swept across the nation would halt that momentum, turning thriving markets into military depots, reshaping city streets into supply routes, and rewriting the lives of every resident. Over the next 15 years, war and its aftermath would etch themselves into the city's fabric, testing Houston's endurance and reshaping its destiny. Houston entered the Civil War as a proud Southern stronghold. The majority of its population supported secession, viewing the Confederacy as a protector of their economy, culture, and way of life. The city's leaders were predominantly slaveholders or aligned with those who were. Newspapers heralded the cause with patriotic fervor, while ministers invoked divine sanction for rebellion. Flags bearing stars and bars replaced Union banners. Military drills filled the courthouse square. Young men enlisted in Confederate regiments by the hundreds. Though the city wasn't a battlefield, its contribution to the Confederate cause was vital. Its warehouses were repurposed into supply depots. Public buildings were commandeered for military use. Foundries adapted their tools to make cannonballs and munitions. The Houston Telegraph, the city's leading newspaper, became a voice for the Southern cause, publishing wartime updates and Confederate proclamations. Confederate military presence in the city was substantial. The area housed several camps and hospitals. Among the most notable was Camp Wall, a training facility for new recruits. Meanwhile, the presence of cavalry units and quartermaster operations underscored Houston's logistical role. The city's status as a rail and river junction made it a nexus point for Confederate troop movement west of the Mississippi. Women stepped into new roles. With many men gone to war, Houston's women managed farms, ran businesses, and staffed hospitals. Some served as nurses, others sewed uniforms, organized relief societies, and maintained correspondence for soldiers. The war's reach into the home was absolute. Even school children were pressed into knitting socks for the troops. Behind the patriotic facade, divisions festered. Not all Houstonians supported the war. Unionist sentiment, while quiet, persisted among German immigrants and some Tejanos. Desertion from Confederate ranks increased as the war dragged on. Economic hardship sowed discontent. By 1864, as food shortages deepened, theft and crime rose. The city's jails overflowed. The final year of the war was one of uncertainty and collapse. Confederate money was nearly worthless. Trade had slowed to a trickle. Crops failed under poor weather and absentee management. In the streets, rumors of Union invasion spread, but no blue-coated armies came. The Bayous carried only drifting wreckage and echoes. Freedom came slowly, not with a roar but a quiet edict from afar. On June 19, 1865, Union troops arrived in Galveston and read aloud General Order No. 3. News filtered up the coast to Houston. Enslaved people heard it first from freedmen. then from Union soldiers, then from reluctant former masters. The announcement was met with disbelief, then with celebration, prayer, and long walks into new lives. In the months that followed, Houston's black population began to reshape the city. Free people formed neighborhoods, Freedmen's Town in the Fourth Ward among the most notable. They built churches, schools, and mutual aid societies. Emancipation had not brought equality, but it had brought agency, and with it came resilience. The Freedmen's Bureau opened offices to aid in the transition, offering legal protection, labor contracts, and educational resources. Black Houstonians seized these opportunities. Teachers arrived from the north. Literacy programs spread. The African Methodist Episcopal Church established new congregations. Community was built, block by block. But the backlash was swift. Former Confederates regained political power. The Black Codes, a set of discriminatory laws, sought to return free people to conditions akin to slavery. Vagrancy laws, restrictive labor contracts, and violence were used to coerce cheap labor. Reconstruction was not just about rebuilding the South, but about controlling who would shape its future. Houston's white elite organized to reclaim authority. The Democratic Party reasserted itself. Vigilant groups patrolled the edges of town. Republican politicians, many of them black or aligned with black voters, were harassed or ousted. Elections turned violent. In 1871, federal troops were again called to protect polling stations. Democracy flickered. Nonetheless, gains were made. The city charter was amended. Public schools were founded, albeit segregated. Infrastructure projects resumed. Streets were graded. Wooden sidewalks laid. Telegraph lines were expanded. In 1872, the Houston and Great Northern Railroad connected the city to East Texas, boosting trade. Warehouses filled again. The spirit of reinvention was strong. Civic leaders spoke of Houston's destiny as a capital of commerce, a beacon of southern industry. They celebrated rail over river, trade over tradition. Even amid national crisis, they dreamed of progress. In 1875, Houston looked both backward and forward. The scars of war remained, in empty lots, in gravestones, in the silence of those lost. But a foundation had been laid. The economy had adapted. New communities had formed. Houston had endured not just a war, but a revolution in labor, race, and governance. It emerged not unbroken, but unyielding, and it was ready to grow again. The last quarter of the 19th century was a time of relentless expansion, and for Houston, it was the era in which its skeletal framework began to flesh out into a city of stature. The sounds of war and reconstruction faded into the rhythmic clang of hammers, the whistle of locomotives, and the multilingual chatter of newcomers unloading into a town brimming with ambition. The pivotal engine behind this transformation was the railroad. Even before the Civil War, rail lines had started snaking their way into Houston, but the decades following 1876 marked a true boom. Houston became a railroad town, its fortunes tied to the iron arteries that spread outward in all directions. It became a hub where east met west, where commerce bypassed slower waterways, and where cotton, lumber, and livestock found faster routes to markets. By the 1880s, Houston was connected to every major city in Texas and to the national rail grid. The Houston and Texas Central Railway, Southern Pacific, Missouri, Kansas and Texas Railway, MKT, and International Great Northern Railroad all had a presence. Railroad depots lined the edges of downtown. Tracks laced the city. Jobs followed. rail hands, switchmen, conductors, engineers, and the dozens of support roles that sustained rail logistics. Rail also enabled the movement of people across great distances, and they came in droves. The city's population nearly doubled between 1870 and 1890. Immigrants poured in from across Europe, Germans, Czechs, Poles, Italians, and Jews seeking economic opportunity, and often escaped from poverty or persecution. Many settled in tight-knit ethnic enclaves, establishing churches, synagogues, language schools, and cultural clubs. These communities infused Houston with new flavors, both literal and figurative. Ethnic groceries stocked pickled herring, rye bread, and olive oil. Bakeries offered strudels beside colleges. Polka music and Italian operas could be heard drifting through Houston's expanding neighborhoods on summer nights. Ethnic newspapers printed the news from home alongside local headlines. These immigrants shaped the soul of the city, anchoring it in traditions that blended the old world with the new. German Texans brought traditions of precision, trade, and community. They built breweries, bakeries, and blacksmith shops. Italians arrived with agricultural know-how, opening groceries and fruit stands. Eastern European Jews became tailors, peddlers, and dry goods merchants. Alongside these were African Americans, moving to Houston in steady numbers, despite the rise of Jim Crow laws elsewhere in the South. Freedmen's Town by the 1880s was a vibrant, self-contained community, rich in churches, schools, and entrepreneurial energy. Industry grew apace. Cotton remained king, but other sectors rose. Lumber mills processed East Texas pine. Brickworks flourished. Ice plants, bottling factories, and metal shops lined the outskirts of town. By the 1890s, oil had not yet reshaped Houston, but its economic muscles were clearly flexing. Warehouses along Buffalo Bayou stocked goods bound for rail cars. Banks and insurance firms opened along Main Street. Downtown Houston took form. Streets were paved with shell, later brick. Gas lights illuminated sidewalks. Horse-drawn trolleys gave way to electrified streetcars. Wooden buildings were replaced with brick storefronts. The city expanded northward, eastward, and into what would become the Heights, platted in the 1890s as one of the South's first planned communities. Real estate speculators laid out neighborhoods, offered home-building incentives, and promoted suburban living for the middle class. Public institutions grew. The city charter was revised multiple times to accommodate new services. Houston's school system expanded. The first public high school, Houston High School, opened in 1883. Libraries followed, including private reading rooms that laid the groundwork for the future public system. Hospitals and charitable clinics began to form, often driven by religious and immigrant groups responding to the needs of their communities. Education became a cornerstone of upward mobility. German immigrants established parochial schools. African American teachers, many trained at historically black colleges, built a nascent system of black education. Women, though not yet voting citizens, formed civic clubs focused on reading, health, and charity. Temperance leagues and suffrage groups quietly emerged, laying the groundwork for the next generation's activism. City Hall struggled to keep up. Infrastructure lagged behind growth. Drainage was poor. The Bayous frequently flooded during heavy rains. Sewers were rudimentary. Clean drinking water was unreliable. Outbreaks of typhoid and cholera were not uncommon. City engineers grappled with how to modernize a town whose rapid expansion outpaced planning. Still, pride in civic identity grew. Parades, fairs, and festivals became regular features. The State Fair of Texas was hosted in Houston in the 1880s before finding a permanent home in Dallas. Juneteenth was celebrated annually in Freedmanstown with parades, sermons, and music. German and Czech communities held festivals that blended old world customs with their new Texan home. Labor unrest occasionally flared. Houston's growing working class, railroad laborers, dock hands, mill workers began to organize. Strikes over wages and hours occurred sporadically. Some unions formed, though often segregated by race and trade. African American workers created mutual aid societies to support each other in the absence of union protections. Women entered factories in growing numbers, forming sewing cooperatives and garment shops. New technologies arrived. The telephone came to Houston in the 1880s. Electricity soon followed, bringing with it electric lights, trams, and mechanized industry. Innovation was visible. The Skylines sprouted taller buildings, and factory whistles blew through the dawn. The social world was evolving too. Newspapers flourished. The Houston Post and Houston Chronicle began competing for readers. Churches and congregations multiplied. Baptist, Methodist, Catholic, Lutheran, Jewish. Fraternal orders, Masons, Oddfellows, Woodmen, offered social cohesion. Baseball became a city obsession. By the 1890s, the Houston Buffaloes were drawing crowds and inspiring local pride. Politically, the city leaned Democratic, but not uniformly. Third parties, populists, prohibitionists, found support among farmers and reformers. Corruption plagued local elections. Voter suppression targeted black and immigrant communities. Yet civic participation remained strong. Public debates, newspaper editorials, and stump speeches were common. By 1899, Houston had changed dramatically from the Bayou frontier town of 1865. It was not yet a metropolis, but it was a city with momentum. Railroads crisscrossed its terrain. Immigrant voices filled its streets. Commerce flowed through its warehouses and stores. Schools and churches dotted its neighborhoods. Challenges remained, especially in health, housing, and equality, but few doubted that Houston's trajectory pointed upward. It was a city poised on the brink of the 20th century, ready for oil, industry, and the upheavals to come. The dawn of the 20th century brought a new kind of energy to Houston, both literal and metaphorical. Though the city had grown steadily through the rails, trade, and immigrant labor of the previous decades, the early 1900s would usher in a transformation so profound that no part of Houston's identity, economy, or landscape would remain untouched. And it all began with a rumble beneath the earth near a place called Spindletop. Located near Beaumont, about 90 miles east of Houston, Spindletop was the site of the first major oil gusher in Texas. On January 10, 1901, a well drilled by Anthony Lucas struck a massive underground reservoir, sending oil shooting over 100 feet into the air. It was an eruption that signaled the birth of the modern oil industry in Texas. Though Spindletop was not in Houston, its impact on the city would be immediate and enduring. Within months, Houston businessmen, investors, and speculators rushed to tap into the growing petroleum market. The city's strategic position, connected by rail, Bayou, and its rising banking infrastructure, made it a natural hub for oil capital. Oil companies sprang up seemingly overnight. Law offices expanded to handle mineral rights. Banks grew fat on speculation. Refineries began to take shape along the coastal plain, and pipelines extended like veins from wellheads to shipping terminals. The new century also brought new faces. As the oil industry expanded, workers flooded into Houston from across Texas and the South. Roughnecks, engineers, and entrepreneurs mingled with railroad men and shopkeepers. The city's population, already on the rise, surged. From fewer than 45,000 in 1900, Houston's numbers swelled dramatically by the start of World War I. Housing demand surged. New residential neighborhoods were platted and built with haste. Montrose, established in 1911, catered to Houston's growing middle class and professionals. The neighborhood's wide boulevards and tree-lined streets marked a departure from the grid-run layout of earlier city blocks. Bungalows, prairie-style homes, and colonial revival houses sprang up in architectural response to the growing prosperity. The arrival of oil money transformed lifestyles. Department stores opened downtown, offering luxury goods imported from New York and Europe. The ornate Sakowitz and Foley Bros stores catered to the elite, while dry goods stores buzzed with clerks fitting suits and dresses for the city's newly affluent middle class. Ice cream parlors, soda fountains, and Nickelodeons added leisure to city life. Newspapers documented every phase of the boom. Headlines in the Houston Post and the Chronicle told of record oil leases, grand civic plans, and the city stepping into modernity. Illustrations showed the rise of smokestacks and silhouettes of derricks at dawn, as Houston came to identify with the imagery of industry. The auto age accelerated rapidly. Houston became one of the first Texas cities to see a significant number of automobiles on the road. New infrastructure followed. In 1913, the city began systematically grading and paving roads for car traffic. Gasoline stations appeared, and the first auto dealerships set up shop on the edges of downtown. Carriage shops transformed into garages. Horses remained, but they were fading. Automobiles brought sprawl. Middle-class families now sought quieter, cleaner places to live beyond the industrial core. Houston's residential footprint expanded west and south. Developers promoted subdivisions with tree-lined streets and promises of modern conveniences. Some of the earliest zoning battles began, residents pushing to separate industrial sites from homes, schools, and churches. Politically, Houston's business elite gained increased sway in city governance. The Chamber of Commerce evolved from a booster organization into a force shaping public policy. Their priority was growth, investment in infrastructure, attracting businesses, and keeping taxes low. Civic pride campaigns highlighted Houston's cleanliness, safety, and upward mobility, though these claims often ignored the poverty visible in working-class and minority neighborhoods. Meanwhile, African American Houstonians continued to build parallel institutions. In Freedman's Town, black-owned newspapers, barbershops, restaurants, and funeral parlors defined the self-reliant community. Educational institutions such as the Colored High School, later Booker T. Washington High, trained new generations. Churches remained central. Mount Corinth, Bethel Baptist, and Antioch were spiritual and social centers. Even under segregation, a culture of dignity and resistance grew. Women's activism took root. Houston's women, especially from middle and upper-class backgrounds, organized clubs focused on education, suffrage, and public health. The Women's Club of Houston and the Houston Civic Club lobbied for school improvements and sanitation reforms. By the mid-1910s, the suffrage movement gained traction, with rallies held in Market Square and letters flooding local newspapers. Progressive ideals infused city leadership with a sense of reform. Entertainment blossomed. The city boasted multiple theatres, including the Majestic and the Prince, offering everything from Shakespearean drama to vaudeville comedy. Touring musicians and actors added prestige. Houston's nightlife grew more cosmopolitan. Jazz bands played in dance halls, while classical ensembles performed in hotel ballrooms. By 1913, the city hosted touring orchestras, and national theatre companies included Houston on their circuit. Immigration remained steady. Beyond European arrivals, small communities of Lebanese, Syrian, and Asian immigrants established themselves, often opening shops and restaurants. Though these groups faced discrimination, many found niches in the growing economy. Chinatown, modest in scale, began to form near the edge of downtown. Street markets, exotic spices, and new dishes diversified the city's palate. Houston also sought to modernize its public services. The creation of a city health department brought more organized responses to outbreaks. Garbage collection became regular. A city-owned electric utility was proposed to compete with private providers. Civic projects like the addition of Herman Park and the establishment of a zoo reflected progressive-era ideals of green space and public enrichment. New schools, improved sewer lines, and paved boulevards became points of local pride. In 1912, Rice Institute, now Rice University, opened its doors. The university, envisioned as a tuition-free institute of higher learning, became a centerpiece of Houston's intellectual life. Its architecture, elegant, grand, and Mediterranean-inspired, stood out amid a landscape still dominated by wooden homes and industrial plants. Rice signaled the city's aspirations. As 1914 approached, optimism filled the city. The opening of the Houston Ship Channel marked a high point in this era, a literal deepening of the city's connection to the world. Houston was no longer a secondary port in the shadow of Galveston. It had asserted itself. A celebratory parade and flotilla marked the occasion. Officials hailed it as the gateway to a new age of Gulf commerce. In retrospect, the period from 1900 to 1914 was one of foundation and ambition. The oil had started flowing. The rails hummed. The ship channel welcomed steel giants from distant lands, and the people, diverse, determined, often divided, had begun forging a city not just of industry, but of identity. Houston, poised on the edge of global conflict, had found its footing. The decade between 1914 and 1925 tested Houston like never before. War, disease, economic volatility, and mounting social tensions collided with the city's burgeoning ambition, reshaping both its landscape and its soul. Houston entered the period with optimism born from oil, railroads, and shipping, but by its end, it had been forged in fire, both literal and figurative. The first tremors came from abroad. In 1914, as war broke out in Europe, most Houstonians were content to observe the distant turmoil from across the Atlantic. But as the war escalated and American involvement deepened, the effects rippled through Houston's economy and daily life. The city's industries, oil, steel, lumber, and shipping, were soon aligned with the national war effort. Houston's port, already transforming thanks to the Houston Ship Channel's 1914 opening, became a vital link in the nation's military supply chain. The channel allowed large-scale export of oil, cotton, and war materials. Shipbuilding accelerated along the Bayous. Employment surged. Docks bustled. The city became a hive of industrial productivity. The demand for labor triggered demographic shifts. Workers from rural Texas, Louisiana, and beyond poured into the city. African Americans, fleeing Jim Crow oppression in the countryside, moved into urban neighborhoods, further growing Freedmen's Town and extending black communities into the 3rd and 5th wards. Immigrants continued to arrive, though wartime suspicion led to tightened restrictions. Housing shortages became widespread, leading to the hasty construction of boarding houses and tenements in downtown districts and beyond. Houston men enlisted in the armed forces by the thousands. Local newspapers printed names of the fallen beside recruitment ads and patriotic poetry. Camp Logan, a military training site built on the western edge of the city in 1917, became the focus of national attention when tensions erupted in one of the darkest chapters in Houston's history. The Camp Logan Mutiny occurred on August 23, 1917. Members of the all-black 24th Infantry Regiment, stationed at the camp and subjected to repeated racial abuse from Houston police and civilians, marched into the city in protest. What began as an act of defiance escalated into chaos and tragedy. A deadly clash ensued, leaving nearly 24 people dead, including soldiers and civilians. In the aftermath, 13 black soldiers were court-martialed and executed, the largest such execution in U.S. military history. The event underscored the entrenched racial divisions in the city and cast a long shadow over civil-military relations. At the same time, the home front faced another invisible threat, the 1918 influenza pandemic. Known colloquially as the Spanish flu, it swept through Houston with deadly speed. Schools closed, public gatherings were banned, and makeshift hospitals were set up in churches and gymnasiums. Local health authorities, still underfunded, scrambled to contain the outbreak. Reports from the Houston Chronicle and Houston Post detailed rows of cots, overwhelmed nurses, and neighbors volunteering as caretakers. By the pandemic's end, thousands of Houstonians had fallen ill and hundreds were dead. The combined effects of war and illness strained every facet of city life. In response to the pandemic, city officials implemented some of Houston's first public health ordinances. Regulations on sanitation, the handling of food in public markets, and the licensing of physicians and midwives were revised and enforced with new urgency. A health commissioner was appointed, and the city's first campaign against tuberculosis gained new momentum. Yet, amid the darkness, Houston pushed forward. Postwar recovery saw a renewed surge in civic development. The city expanded its utility services, electricity, clean water, and public transportation. Paved streets reach into new subdivisions. Electric streetcars hum through growing neighborhoods like Montrose, Woodland Heights, and the newly emerging River Oaks, envisioned as a model of suburban elegance. The oil industry continued its ascent. Though Spindletop had declined, newer fields in East Texas and along the Gulf Coast fed refineries clustered in and around Houston. The city's status as a petrochemical hub was solidified. Port traffic grew exponentially. Railroad yards lengthened. Banks swelled with investment capital. Oil barons and speculative entrepreneurs established offices in downtown high-rises, reshaping the skyline with ever-taller buildings. Women's roles changed dramatically. During the war, they had taken jobs vacated by men, clerical roles, factory work, even transit operators. After the war, many remained in the workforce. The suffrage movement, long active in the city's women's clubs, saw victory in 1920 when the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. That fall, thousands of Houston women cast ballots for the first time. Political clubs and civic associations sprouted, and women became influential in school board elections, city sanitation initiatives, and charity drives. Cultural life rebounded with energy. Theatres hosted post-war vaudeville, silent films, and touring musicians. Schools added music and art programs. Local orchestras and choirs formed. Churches remained influential, but Houston's civic identity grew more secular, shaped by cultural events, parades, fairs, and growing press coverage. In 1921, Houston launched its first public radio broadcasts, music, sermons, and local news beaming from modest transmitter towers into living rooms. The city's black community, despite the legacy of Camp Logan and enduring segregation, continued to assert its presence. Black-owned newspapers like the Houston Informer chronicled both injustice and resilience. Religious institutions, particularly Baptist and Methodist churches, remained pillars of the community. Black fraternal organizations, social clubs, and entrepreneurial networks strengthened. A black chamber of commerce was formed, and by 1925, black Houstonian professionals, doctors, teachers, attorneys, were numerous enough to sustain their own business directories. Real estate became a powerful force. Developers sought to reshape the city's image. New building codes were proposed. Public parks and boulevards were added. The Houston Zoo opened in 1922 as part of Herman Park, which itself had expanded as a symbol of the city's commitment to public space. The Rice Hotel was renovated into a symbol of urban grandeur. Despite this progress, deep divides remained. Racial segregation was enforced in housing, education, and employment. Labor unrest emerged as unions demanded fair wages and safer working conditions. Strikes occurred in rail yards, warehouses, and shipyards. The political climate grew tense as Houston's leaders tried to balance rapid growth with control. By 1925, Houston had become a city both invigorated and tested. It had endured war, buried its pandemic dead, absorbed social upheaval, and emerged larger and more complex. Its skyline was taller, its people more numerous, its industry more powerful, but its soul remained in flux, a city still grappling with who it was and who it was becoming. This chapter, like the age it describes, is not one of triumph alone. It is one of trial, by fire, illness, protest, and change. And through it all, the city kept moving, building, dreaming. Houston was not just growing, it was becoming. The mid-1920s marked an era of acceleration and artistic ambition in Houston. It was a time when the city shed the last remnants of its frontier legacy and stepped confidently into the American modern age. Wealth, style, and optimism defined the era, and Houston stood among the southern cities reshaped by roaring prosperity. Oil, as ever, was the catalyst. Spindletop's legacy had been eclipsed by new fields, especially those in Humble, Goose Creek, and along the Gulf Coast. Oil wasn't just extracted, it was refined, traded, speculated upon. Houston's skyline grew bolder with every new derrick and corporate tower. By 1925, petroleum had permeated every aspect of civic life, from local bank portfolios to university endowments, from transportation infrastructure to the fuel in every city vehicle. The city's downtown bore the markers of this wealth. The rise of Art Deco and neoclassical buildings gave Houston its first brush with architectural grandeur. The Gulf Building, with its clean lines and limestone facade, quickly became a landmark, its construction symbolizing the confidence of a city no longer looking inward but outward, upward, and beyond. The 37 stories of ambition housed law firms, oil consortiums and banks, places where fortunes were made behind thick mahogany doors and under the glow of electric chandeliers. Skyscrapers were not the only architectural achievements. Civic buildings, churches and mansions in neighborhoods like River Oaks and Montrose embraced styles from Mediterranean Revival to Tudor. These were not just homes, they were statements. A city once defined by Bayou mud and cotton bales now boasted tree-lined boulevards and private tennis courts. River Oaks Country Club opened in 1927, drawing in elite clientele eager to showcase Houston's social ascent. Transportation flourished. Paved roads snaked through the suburbs. The electric streetcar system reached its zenith, connecting downtown with outlying neighborhoods in a web of steel. Yet the automobile was rapidly becoming king. Dealerships lined South Main. Filling stations multiplied. Sunday drives became family traditions. Real estate advertisements emphasized garages as a sign of modern convenience. The city was no longer walking, it was driving. Houston's port expanded to match its ambitions. The Houston Ship Channel underwent dredging projects to accommodate larger vessels. Warehouses multiplied along the waterfront. By 1928, the port ranked among the busiest in the United States by tonnage, surpassing older rivals in New Orleans and Mobile. Oil tankers, cotton steamers, and lumber barges floated side by side, while railways and trucks extended the port's reach deep into the Texas interior. Culturally, the 1920s sparkled. Houston became a regional arts center. The Museum of Fine Arts, founded in 1900 but expanded during this era, hosted international exhibits and cultivated local patronage. Private collectors donated Impressionist and American Realist paintings. Music thrived as well. The Houston Symphony, formally organized in the 1910s, matured into a polished ensemble performing at the city auditorium and social clubs. Nightlife also blossomed. Prohibition, far from quieting the city, added an element of speakeasy glamour. Illegal bars flourished in basements and behind cafes. Jazz bands played deep into the night, and liquor flowed in private clubs, bootleg joints, and elite homes alike. Montrose, with its mix of bohemian spirit and upper-middle-class charm, became a center for music, theater, and avant-garde art. Theaters competed for audiences with opulent interiors and promises of cinematic splendor. The Metropolitan Theater on Main Street dazzled with its elaborate domes, columns, and murals. The Majestic and Lowe's presented silent films accompanied by live orchestras, along with vaudeville acts and newsreels. Movie-going became a cherished ritual across class lines, a moment where laborers and bankers shared the same rows. Public education expanded. New schools opened across the city, reflecting the population boom. Houston Independent School District embraced progressive reforms. Vocational training, standardized testing, and investments in school infrastructure. The city's first junior high schools debuted, easing the transition between primary education and high school. Education, long a private concern, became a civic pillar. Rice Institute continued to thrive, offering rigorous science and engineering programs. Though its student body remained mostly white and male, its reputation for academic excellence began to grow beyond the South. Endowments swelled from oil royalties, allowing the university to hire top faculty and expand research. Even as the elite grew more visible, Houston's working class remained vital to its function. Thousands labored in shipyards, oil fields, rail yards, and construction sites. Labor unions gained modest ground in advocating better hours and safer conditions, though unionization remained tenuous. African American workers faced deep segregation, but carved out employment niches as porters, cooks, domestic workers, and skilled tradesmen. In Freedman's Town and beyond, black Houstonians built a parallel cultural infrastructure. Churches, barbershops, newspapers, and fraternal lodges served as anchors. Schools, underfunded yet determined, turned out graduates who went on to teach, preach, and organize. The colored Carnegie Library served as both a research center and community hub. Though excluded from the city's major institutions, black residents asserted their presence through education, enterprise, and culture. Despite the prosperity, undercurrents of tension existed. Economic inequality widened. Housing segregation was entrenched. The Ku Klux Klan, while less overt than in earlier years, retained influence in politics and policing. Immigrant communities, particularly Mexican, Italian, and Jewish Houstonians, faced coded prejudice even as they opened stores, restaurants, and businesses that defined the city's daily life. Houston, by 1929, had become a study in contrasts. The wealthiest residents attended galas beneath crystal chandeliers while dockworkers toiled for pennies. Art and industry shared the skyline. Optimism reigned, but always with shadows at its edge. The great crash of 1929 had not yet arrived, but the city for now rode high on a tide of oil, culture, and modernity. This was Houston before the fall, a city roaring into its own myth. When the stock market collapsed in October 1929, the tremors that shook Wall Street were felt as far south as the muddy Bayous of Houston. Though the city had ridden the oil boom of the 1920s to heights of prosperity and architectural ambition, it was not immune to the nationwide descent into economic hardship. Over the next decade, Houston would endure contraction, transformation, and resilience, all while laying the groundwork for the next great expansion. At first, the city appeared insulated. Oil revenues, shipping contracts, and real estate speculation had fortified Houston's confidence. The Houston Ship Channel, widened and deepened just a few years earlier, kept oil tankers and cargo ships bustling in and out of port. Business leaders insisted Houston's diversified economy, bolstered by cotton, lumber, chemicals, and oil, would ride out the storm. Newspapers even printed optimistic headlines in late 1929, calling the crash a correction, not a catastrophe. But denial faded quickly. By early 1930, the tremors of collapse reached Houston's industries. Construction halted. Office buildings once planned for the skyline were left as unfinished steel frames. The value of cotton plummeted, and with it, the economic base of surrounding rural counties. Sawmills in East Texas went quiet. Real estate listings filled newspapers with unsold homes. Pawn shops thrived. Layoffs became rampant. Skilled workers, teachers, engineers, and oilfield crews were all affected. Between 1931 and 1933, Houston's unemployment rate tripled. By some estimates, 1 in 4 Houstonians were without steady work. Men lined up at day labor depots. Former middle-class families shared homes with relatives or took in boarders. Children scavenged for scrap metal and coal along railway tracks. Those hit hardest were already near the margins. African Americans, confined to segregated neighborhoods and often locked out of unions, saw job opportunities disappear. In the Third Ward and Freedman's Town, families made do with less. Churches like Antioch Baptist and Trinity East hosted communal meals, while women's clubs stitched quilts and organized childcare. Many Black Houstonians took domestic or menial jobs below their training just to survive. Mexican and Mexican-American communities also faced acute hardship. Immigration raids intensified, and federal repatriation programs deported entire families, some of whom had lived in Texas for decades. Many left voluntarily under pressure, while others resisted, organizing through churches and mutualista societies to demand relief and justice. Houston's civic leaders lobbied for federal assistance. By 1933, New Deal programs began trickling into the city. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, Public Works Administration, PPLA, and Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, opened new avenues for employment. Infrastructure projects included road paving, school construction, and drainage systems that would serve the city for decades. The WPA alone employed thousands, laying bricks for sidewalks, building gymnasiums at public schools, painting murals in courthouses, and cataloging city archives. In some neighborhoods, entire streetscapes were transformed with WPA funds. Unemployed musicians were hired to perform in public parks. Theater groups staged Shakespeare in school auditoriums. Houston's municipal airport, begun before the crash, was completed in 1937 with PWA assistance. The Art Deco terminal and runways brought the city into the aviation age. Air traffic remained light, but the symbolism was potent. Houston was still looking upward. The city's public health system evolved. The Depression had revealed glaring gaps in sanitation, maternal care, and disease prevention. Clinics were established in underserved areas. Public vaccination drives were launched. Tuberculosis sanatoriums expanded, and nurses visited homes to provide prenatal care and nutrition education. Education remained a civic priority. Despite financial strain, HISD avoided mass closures. Teachers accepted salary reductions and sometimes paid for classroom supplies themselves. Evening classes offered adult education. In black schools, community volunteers made repairs, and older students taught younger ones. Booker T. Washington High School became a model of perseverance and academic pride. In downtown Houston, many office buildings remained occupied, though rent rates dropped. Law firms consolidated. Department stores like Foley's and Sakowitz reduced staff but maintained ornate holiday displays to uplift morale. Customers purchased on credit, and installment plans became the norm. Entertainment adapted to the mood. Theaters offered double features and discount matinees. Jazz clubs, though often segregated, stayed open. Churches hosted concerts and radio ministries flourished. Local stations like KTRH aired sermons, Roosevelt's fireside chats, and the latest big band recordings. Radio became both escapism and information. One of the most transformative initiatives was the development of public housing. With support from the U.S. Housing Authority, Houston built some of Texas' first federally funded housing projects. In 1939, the San Felipe Courts opened in the 4th Ward, offering affordable housing to low-income black families. Though segregated, these projects signaled a shift in public responsibility for urban living conditions. Houston's neighborhoods shifted. The Heights weathered the Depression better than some areas, its residents bolstered by tight-knit churches and civic clubs. Montrose, known for its mix of artists and professionals, remained a cultural hub. River Oaks solidified as a bastion of wealth, its residents less affected thanks to oil royalties and family fortunes. Political shifts emerged as well. Voter participation increased. Citizens began demanding more from local officials. Public meetings drew large crowds. Candidates ran on reform platforms. African American and Mexican American civic leaders, though still barred from many processes, began laying the groundwork for future movements. Despite adversity, civic pride became a tool for resilience. In 1934, the city organized a massive centennial celebration commemorating the founding of the Republic of Texas. Parades rolled through downtown streets, filled with floats from local schools, labor unions, and ethnic clubs. Flags waved, and children dressed in pioneer costumes reenacted battles and settler stories. It was a moment of historical reflection, a way for Houstonians to anchor themselves to the idea of perseverance. Infrastructure development became both a necessity and a statement of survival. Buffalo Bayou was rechanneled in some sections to mitigate flooding. New bridges were constructed to connect outlying districts. Municipal buildings adopted simplified Art Deco styles, blending function with understated elegance. These projects were often executed with federal help, but local craftsmanship was evident in every brick laid. One of the most symbolic achievements was the completion of Houston Municipal Airport in 1937. Air travel was still a luxury, but the airport represented ambition and connectivity. Its Art Moderne terminal, streamlined and hopeful, welcomed a new era. Houston now looks skyward, not just for oil derricks, but for airplanes linking it to Dallas, New Orleans, and beyond. During this same period, cultural voices grew bolder. Writers chronicled the effects of poverty and race. Poets published in small circulation journals or read aloud at local cafes. Painters depicted Houston's skyline with a mixture of reverence and critique. Black artists, often excluded from white institutions, formed their own guilds and exhibits in church basements and high school gymnasiums. Neighborhoods became more defined. The Heights retained its independent spirit. Montrose became a haven for artists and young professionals. Third Ward pulsed with entrepreneurial energy. New subdivisions sprouted to the south and west, marketed to upwardly mobile families looking for space and modern amenities. Realtors pushed hard, offering credit terms and discounts, desperate to move properties during lean years. Civic reformers used the Depression to push structural changes. Calls for city government modernization echoed through newspaper columns. Civil service systems were introduced to limit patronage. Voting reforms were proposed to increase participation. And through it all, Houstonians debated what kind of city they wanted once the crisis passed. As 1939 approached, the evidence of recovery could be seen not just in rising steel frames or balanced city budgets, but in the tone of the city itself. Streetcars ran on time again. Stores extended hours. Children skipped through schoolyards in newly painted buildings. Sunday newspapers grew thicker. The wounds of the Depression remained visible, but so too did the scars of healing. Houston had endured a decade defined by collapse, but not by defeat. It would enter the next era wiser, leaner, and ready to serve not only as an oil capital, but as an industrial giant in what would soon become the arsenal of democracy. When World War II erupted in Europe in 1939, Houston was still emerging from the long shadows of the Great Depression. Though the city had weathered the economic storm better than many, its scars remained visible. Unemployment lingered and civic services were only just beginning to stabilize. Yet, within 6 short years, Houston would transform into one of the most critical centers of American wartime industry. a key node in the so-called arsenal of democracy. At first, America remained officially neutral, still haunted by the memories of World War I. Many Houstonians were hesitant about involvement in another overseas conflict. But neutrality did not mean inaction. Even before Pearl Harbor, Houston's economy began retooling for what seemed increasingly inevitable war. Federal defense contracts poured into the city: oil, shipping, rail, and chemicals. Houston's 4 economic pillars were all suddenly crucial to national security. The Houston Ship Channel underwent immediate and dramatic transformation. To accommodate larger naval and supply vessels, the channel was dredged deeper and wider. New turning basins were carved. Dock cranes and oil loading terminals were modernized. Warehouses sprang up along Buffalo Bay like steel cathedrals, echoing with the clang of machinery and the bark of foremen. In 1942, the Brown Shipbuilding Company was founded by brothers Herman and George R. Brown of Brown and Root. Almost overnight, the company transformed from a general construction firm into a premier naval contractor. Located on the northern bank of the channel, Brown Shipbuilding became a beehive of industrial might. By war's end, it would build over 80 destroyer escorts and hundreds of other vessels, employing more than 25,000 workers at its peak. Its workers included men and women, black and white, many of them learning trades they would carry into the post-war years. Houston's oil refineries, long focused on regional markets, shifted gears to supply the war machine. Aviation fuel, motor oil, hydraulic fluid, and synthetic rubber were in urgent demand. Baytown and Pasadena became centers of innovation. Companies like Humble Oil, later Exxon, worked alongside federal agencies to develop more efficient refining methods. Entire new refining complexes were constructed in less than a year, an unheard-of pace made possible by 24/7 construction and abundant manpower. Synthetic rubber became especially vital after Japan seized control of Southeast Asia's rubber plantations. Houston's petrochemical complex rose to the occasion. New plants developed ethylene and butadiene, the building blocks of synthetic rubber. Chemists, engineers, and factory workers became unwitting pioneers of a new industrial age. Their work not only fueled tanks and aircraft, it would lay the foundation for the city's chemical dominance in the decades to come. The human tide surged into Houston. Between 1940 and 1945, the population grew by nearly 40%. Families from rural Texas and neighboring states poured into the city in search of opportunity. Apartment buildings were hastily converted from single-family homes. Churches opened gymnasiums to house workers. Lines for groceries and utilities stretched around blocks. Yet the city adapted, expanding public transportation and utilities to meet the demand. African American Houstonians seized the moment. Though discrimination and segregation remained pervasive, the war opened limited new doors. Defense plants, under pressure from federal mandates, began hiring black workers. Some shipyards and foundries instituted equal pay policies. Black women found work as clerks, nurses, and technical assistants. Though relegated to separate facilities and often denied promotions, their presence reshaped the city's labor force. The war also accelerated Mexican-American integration into Houston's economy. Long confined to low-wage agricultural and service work, many found stable jobs in shipyards, manufacturing, and logistics. Language barriers and prejudice remained, but the war gave many a foothold into industrial labor. Bilingual education, though rare, gained early support in East End schools during this time. Women filled jobs at every level. They became welders, switchboard operators, assembly line workers, draftsmen and mechanics. Rosie the Rifter was not just a poster, she was a neighbor, a sister, a wife. Many had never worked outside the home before. Daycare centers, sponsored by federal grants and private employers, sprang up to support working mothers. For many, the war years were a first taste of independence and professional identity. Civic life also shifted. War bomb drives were ubiquitous. Posters plastered shop windows and post offices. Children participated in scrap metal collections. Schools taught air raid drills. Civil defense wardens patrolled neighborhoods. Churches held prayer vigils for the troops and collected funds for the Red Cross. The sense of shared mission permeated all corners of life. Military installations dotted the landscape. Ellington Field was reactivated and expanded, becoming a key training site for bomber crews and air navigation specialists. Camp Wallace and Camp Logan trained ground forces. Houston's proximity to the Gulf made it a key strategic point for coastal defense, and rumors of German U-boats off Galveston kept nerves on edge. At the University of Houston, enrollment dipped as students enlisted, but the school quickly became a site of military training. Programs in aeronautical engineering and radio technology catered to the war effort. The Texas Medical Center, still in its infancy, trained schools of nurses and field medics. Hospitals treated returning wounded, including those evacuated from the Pacific Theater. The cultural scene did not go dormant during the war, it evolved. Jazz clubs in the Third Ward stayed open late, hosting interracial crowds despite the risks. Traveling entertainers stopped in Houston to perform at military hospitals and USO halls. Community theater staged patriotic plays, while local artists painted murals at schools and city halls under WPA commissions. Tensions occasionally flared. Labor strikes threatened production timelines. Race riots loomed after police violence or housing conflicts. The wartime demand for unity did not erase long-standing injustices. But amidst the tension, Houston's residents pressed on. When victory came in 1945, the celebration was euphoric. Thousands poured into downtown. Church bells rang. Factories blew their whistles. Soldiers returned to hugs, banners, and tearful reunions at Union Station. But with peace came new challenges: housing shortages, inflation, demobilization. Still, the infrastructure laid during the war, both physical and social, ensured that Houston would not return to its pre-war scale or tempo. Houston emerged from World War II not just as a survivor, but as a symbol of transformation. It had proven it could build, innovate, and adapt. It had trained new generations of workers, engineers, and leaders. It had attracted international attention. And though the war had ended, Houston's rise was only beginning. The war was over. The world had exhaled. And in Houston, the air smelled like opportunity. It was 1946, and the city that had built destroyers and refinery valves now turned its eyes to a different kind of future, one shaped not by ration books and sirens, but by optimism, movement, and invention. In neighborhoods shaded by pecan trees and oak, families returned from the front, pulled their cars into driveways still made of gravel, and looked for homes to raise children who might never know a world at war. In the quiet hours of early morning, a new sound joined the chorus of the city: hammers striking fresh lumber, the whir of cement mixers pouring foundations. Houston was building, and it would not stop. The population had already swelled during the war years. factories, and shipyards had drawn workers from across the South. But in peace, the numbers grew even faster. Soldiers came home, enrolled in college under the GI Bill, and bought modest new homes with low-interest loans on the city's expanding edge. Between 1940 and 1950, Houston added nearly 200,000 new residents, and by 1960 it would nearly double again. It was a new kind of growth, outward instead of upward. Neighborhoods like Garden Oaks, Oak Forest, Sharpstown, and Spring Branch bloomed on former farmland. Developers laid out curving streets with tidy names: Penny Point, Willow Bend, Meadow Creek, each conjuring a sense of tranquil possibility. Front lawns were clipped and green, and children rode their bikes in loops around cul-de-sacs, while transistor radios played soft crooners from the dashboard of new Chevrolets. These were the early days of the American suburb, and Houston, with its open land and car culture, embraced it fully. But this was not just a suburban shift. It was a freeway revolution. In 1948, construction began on the Gulf Freeway, Texas' first true urban expressway. It would link downtown Houston with Galveston to the south, slicing across the East End and carving a new path for commuters. Where streetcars once rattled and two-lane roads meandered, the freeway surged forward, a wide concrete river with on-ramps like tributaries. Soon followed the Katy Freeway to the west, the North Freeway toward Dallas, and others, the spokes of a wheel extending in all directions. This was a city built not for pedestrians or streetcars, but for the automobile. The hum of tires on pavement became Houston's heartbeat. Gas stations bloomed on corners. Drive-in diners appeared, glowing with neon signs and teenage laughter. Families loaded into station wagons with chrome bumpers and headed to Saturday matinees or air-conditioned department stores, where escalators seemed like minor miracles. At the city center, downtown still held the majesty of commerce, steel-framed buildings with limestone facades, where bankers in white shirts and oilmen in boots struck quiet deals in boardrooms thick with cigar smoke. But increasingly, the energy of the city was moving outward toward shopping centers, subdivision schools, and highways that promised speed, convenience, and escape. In 1947, one of the most transformative moments arrived. Houston doubled in physical size. Through a sweeping annexation effort, city leaders incorporated large swaths of land that included many of the suburban neighborhoods just being developed. The city expanded its reach and its tax base, setting the stage for decades of decentralized growth. It was a strategy rooted not just in governance, but in ambition. More space meant more people. More people meant more roads, more homes, more schools. And so they came. By the early 1950s, the city was swelling with optimism. War had brought scientific miracles. Now peace would bring material ones. Houston homes filled with new inventions, dishwashers, televisions, air conditioners. The heat of a Gulf Coast summer was no longer a barrier to comfort, and the city proudly called itself the most air-conditioned city in America. Cool air poured from vents in department stores, theaters, and buses. At night, people strolled through air-conditioned supermarkets with bright fluorescent lighting, marveling at the abundance, rows of canned peaches, frozen dinners, and cereals in cheerful boxes. It was modern life delivered daily. And with this modernity came education. The University of Houston, once a junior college, was growing fast. Enrollment ballooned after the war, fueled by returning veterans and new state support. On the city's west side, new high schools were built seemingly overnight to accommodate the flood of baby boom children entering classrooms. Lamar, Bellaire, and Waltreux became familiar names on school jackets and football programs. In the heart of the city, something else was growing too: the Texas Medical Center. What had begun with a quiet donation of land in the 1940s had become, by the 1950s, a world-class cluster of hospitals, research labs, and clinics. Doctors came from around the country to study, treat, and discover. The scent of rubbing alcohol and optimism drifted through its halls. MD Anderson Cancer Center was still young, but its reputation was growing. Babies were born at Herman, surgeries performed at Methodist, and students trained at Baylor College of Medicine. The medical center was not just a place. It was a promise that Houston could heal, innovate, and lead. But not all of Houston shared equally in this progress. As white families moved into the growing suburbs, black families remained largely confined to segregated neighborhoods like the 3rd Ward, 5th Ward, and parts of Acres Homes. Redlining, racial covenants, and informal barriers made it nearly impossible for black Houstonians to buy homes in most of the new developments. FAR loans that fueled suburban growth were routinely denied to black applicants, even when their credit was strong. So while the post-war boom lifted some, it left others behind. In these communities, churches became pillars of strength. Antioch Baptist, Trinity United Methodist, and Wheeler Avenue were more than houses of worship. They were schools, social centers, and political incubators. Teachers, preachers, and barbers all carried the quiet fire of progress, teaching children to dream beyond their circumstances, even as the world placed limits around them. Public schools were still segregated by law. White students attended campuses with modern facilities and new textbooks. Black students learned in aging buildings with hand-me-down books and too few resources. Yet the spirit inside these schools could not be measured in square footage. Teachers instilled pride and expectation. Children recited Langston Hughes and learned of Booker T. Washington. They knew change would come, even if they didn't know when. Meanwhile, Mexican-American families, many of whom had lived in Houston for generations, faced their own barriers. In the East End and the 2nd Ward, children spoke Spanish at home, but were punished for it at school. Laborers worked long hours in warehouses, canneries, and railroad yards, but seldom saw paths to advancement. Yet they built vibrant communities with their own churches, restaurants, and traditions. Guadalupe Plaza echoed with music on weekends. Tortillas cooked on hot griddles. Stories passed from abuela to child under porch lights. By the mid-1950s, quiet cracks were beginning to appear in the structures of segregation. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The ruling sent ripples through Houston, even if immediate change did not follow. City leaders were cautious. Desegregation would be slow and calculated. Resistance would be real. Still, the future had been announced. And the same year, another symbolic shift occurred. That summer, Elvis Presley played his first Houston show at the City Auditorium. His music, fusing black rhythm and blues with country twang, offended many, thrilled more, and hinted at a new cultural moment forming beneath the surface. Houston teens danced in living rooms. The old world was slipping. Throughout this period, the weather remained a constant. Summers arrived with blistering heat, the Gulf humidity heavy and intimate. Afternoon storms rolled in, cooling the streets and flooding low-lying areas. The Bayous, always just beneath the surface of the city's memory, occasionally surged with anger. But for most, they remained background. silent green ribbons winding past parking lots and billboard signs. It was during this era that the city's identity became inseparable from its sprawl. There was no zoning in Houston, no central plan to dictate where homes, businesses, or factories should go. And in these post-war years, that flexibility became a virtue. Developers could build quickly and cheaply. Gas stations stood beside diners beside barber shops. Strip malls dotted the horizon. The car reigned supreme. People wanted driveways, not trolleys. The last of the electric streetcars were decommissioned in 1947. Where rails had once sparked and screeched, rubber tires now rolled. City planners introduced the concept of the loop, a beltway that would encircle the urban core. Interstate 610 was envisioned as a ring road to absorb the swelling suburbs. Though its construction would not be complete until the 1970s, the idea itself reshaped how Houstonians thought about distance, direction, and belonging. Inside the loop meant old Houston. Outside it, the future was being poured in concrete. Television also arrived, and with it, a new window into the world. Local stations broadcast live coverage of baseball games, soap operas, and news from faraway lands. Families gathered around wooden sets with flickering screens, mesmerized by the world unfolding in black and white. Houston had always been a frontier city. Now it was a modern one, shaped as much by imagery as by geography. In the final years of the 1950s, the city stood on the threshold of something even greater. The Astrodome was still a dream. NASA had yet to arrive, and the great civil rights movements were still gathering their strength. But the outlines were visible. Change was coming, not in flashes, but in the slow accumulation of new ideas, new faces, and new hopes. Suburban homes multiplied, highways lengthened, families filled parks, churches, and shopping centers. The city became a patchwork of rhythms, some fast, some slow, all converging under a warm, cloud-streaked sky. And in the stillness between those rhythms, if you listened closely, you could hear it, the heartbeat of a city reimagining itself. Not in revolution, but in repetition. Not in grand gestures, but in morning routines and weekend drives and the hum of air conditioners cooling a house built yesterday on land that once held rice fields and oaks. This was the Houston of the 1950s. Sprawling, inventive, contradictory. A city whose future would not be constrained by its past, but shaped by it. Brick by brick, block by block, mile by expanding mile. The sun rose quietly over the Gulf in January of 1960. The water shimmered in tones of steel and gold, and the hum of a growing city stirred into motion once again. Houston had entered a new decade, one that would lift its name to the heavens and deepen its ties to the ground beneath its feet. The city was larger now, more confident. The post-war boom had hardened into a kind of rhythm. Freeways looped and stretched. Suburbs sprawled. Refineries pulsed and hissed on the ship channel. And the Texas Medical Center gleamed with white stone and glass, a citadel of science on the prairie's edge. The air smelled like asphalt, magnolia, and ambition. And then, one day, it smelled like space. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy made a promise. Before the decade was out, the United States would send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth. It was a lofty goal, spoken into the Cold War wind, and it needed a home, a mission control, a hub, a nerve center. NASA chose Houston. The news broke like thunder. The Manned Spacecraft Center, later renamed the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center, would be built on 1,000 acres of former pastureland southeast of the city near Clear Lake. Engineers arrived by the hundreds, then the thousands, many from California, some from the East Coast, nearly all full of wonder. They brought families, ideas, and blueprints. They brought coffee and purpose. They brought the future. Overnight, a sleepy area near Galveston Bay transformed. Where cows had grazed, office parks rose. Schools sprouted to serve their children. A city within a city was born. The surrounding neighborhood, Clear Lake City, became synonymous with science, optimism, and the hum of possibility. Astronauts trained in flight simulators. Engineers ran calculations by hand. Computers the size of walk-in closets plotted trajectories to orbit. Mission control was no longer science fiction. It was a glass and concrete building humming under fluorescent light. The language of Houston began to change. It spoke now in acronyms: GASC, NASA, the LEO-EVA. It whispered in kilohertz and vacuum pressures. And when astronauts in orbit needed help, they didn't call Washington or New York or Los Angeles. They called Houston. In 1962, Kennedy visited the city and gave one of the most iconic speeches in American history. Standing beneath the vast roof of Rice Stadium, under the relentless Texas sun, he declared, "We choose to go to the moon." The crowd cheered. The city leaned in. There was something in the air, hope maybe, or the faint scent of rocket fuel. But the 1960s were never just about space. While NASA built rockets, Houston's soul was wrestling with deeper truths on the streets, in schools, and behind stained glass windows. Civil rights had come to Houston slowly, and then suddenly. For decades, Black Houstonians had lived in a separate world. Separate schools, separate lunch counters, separate drinking fountains. They worshipped in black churches, studied in black colleges, ate in black-owned cafes. Their communities were strong, but the boundaries were tight, and people had had enough. In 1960, just weeks after the Greensboro sit-ins in North Carolina, students at Texas Southern University organized their own protests. They marched down the streets of Third Ward, polite but firm, demanding the end of segregation in downtown lunch counters. The city's leadership was cautious. Houston had long preferred quiet compromise over confrontation, but the energy was undeniable. Change had entered the room, and it would not leave quietly. Desegregation began slowly in schools, with token integration in select high schools. By mid-decade, federal pressure grew, and Houston's public schools opened more widely to black students. The process was uneven, often painful, but it moved forward. Teachers adapted. Students watched. The old lines, once painted so thick, began to blur. In 1965, Barbara Jordan, a soft-spoken but brilliant lawyer from Houston's Fifth Ward, made history by becoming the first African-American woman elected to the Texas Senate since Reconstruction. Her voice, measured, thoughtful, powerful, carried across courtroom walls and Capitol floors. She would become one of the most respected figures of her generation. And it all started here in Houston, among the oaks and asphalt. Elsewhere in the city, other boundaries were being redrawn. Mexican-American Houstonians, long invisible to much of the political system, began to organize. In the East End, families who had lived in the city for generations started to demand better schools, fair housing, and a voice in decisions that affected their lives. Activists like Leonel Castillo rose to prominence, blending quiet dignity with political savvy. In 1969, Castillo would become the first Latino elected to a major citywide office. Houston was changing, not in a single wave, but in 1,000 small ripples. Downtown, the skyline began to stretch higher. The humble oil building loomed tall. New banks, hotels, and corporate towers filled the grill of streets that had once been muddy wagon paths. The Astrodome, the eighth wonder of the world, opened in 1965, a vast air-conditioned cathedral to sport, science, and spectacle. Inside, grass grew under artificial light. Outside, families parked in wide lots and marveled at the sheer scale of the thing. The Houston Astros, newly renamed from the Colt 45s, played beneath the domed steel trusses. It was baseball, yes, but it felt like something more. It felt like the future. The city's freeway system continued to expand. Interstate 610, the Loop, crept toward completion, encircling the inner city like a belt. U.S. Highways 59, 290, 45, and 10 sliced across town, guiding commuters and travelers toward homes, jobs, and open land. It was a time of driving, of motels and billboards and drive-through banks. Families fled downtown congestion for the space and quiet of new suburbs, Westbury, Spring Branch, Myoland. Zoning still did not exist. It never had. So the city grew like a field of wildflowers, fast, unregulated, and full of contradiction. A liquor store beside a church, a strip mall beside a mansion. Houston's chaos was its freedom. The city absorbed other towns. Areas like Fondren Southwest and Alief were annexed or brought into the orbit of Houston's expanding infrastructure. Schools multiplied. Parks were added. But the city's growth also stretched its services thin. Sewage, transit, and policing struggled to keep pace. The tension between sprawl and service would only grow in the decades to come. Meanwhile, in the quiet corners of homes, something else was happening. Children watched the news on black and white televisions. They saw marches in Selma, riots in Watts, speeches on the Mall in Washington. They watched the funerals of President Kennedy, Malcolm X, Dr. King. And in Houston, they asked questions. Parents tried to answer. The world was shifting beneath their feet, and the questions were only getting bigger. At the same time, music changed. The jukeboxes in Houston diners no longer played only swing or crooners. Now there was rock and roll, soul, country, and blues. Clubs in Third Ward echoed with the sounds of Sam Cooke and Otis Redding. Teenagers gathered at record stores, played guitars in garages, and dreamed of writing songs that could be heard beyond the loop. Houston was a music city now, if only quietly. And yet, for all this cultural movement, one moment would define the decade, perhaps even the century, for this city. On July 20, 1969, millions of Americans gathered around television sets. In Houston, families in every neighborhood leaned in as grainy images from 240,000 miles away flickered onto the screen. The voices were scratchy, the picture blurred, but the words were clear. Houston Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Those words were not chosen at random. Houston was the first word spoken from the surface of the moon. A nod to the city that had guided the mission, trained the astronauts, run the simulations, and held its breath with the rest of the world. In homes across the city, black, white, Latino, Asian, people cheered, cried, or simply stared in silence. The impossible had become real. And their city, so often overlooked, was suddenly at the center of the universe. Neil Armstrong's voice echoed through mission control, through living rooms, through time itself. Houston had touched the stars. But after the applause, after the ticker tape and the slow-motion replays, the city remained what it had always been, a place of contrasts, of promise and inequality, of beauty and heat and rain and rising tides, a place built on Bayous and big dreams. As the 1960s came to a close, Houston stood transformed. It was no longer just a port or a rail hub or a frontier outpost. It was a space city, a civil rights city, a place where change was not just tolerated but manufactured like steel or gasoline or moonlight. It was messy. It was massive. It was moving faster than anyone could quite comprehend. But it was Houston, and it was just getting started. The decade opened beneath a thick and hazy sky. The summer heat in Houston had always been formidable, but something in the air now buzzed differently. The hum of construction cranes, the throb of oil rigs, the soft flutter of paperwork in tall new buildings. It was 1970, and the city stood on the edge of a boom like no other. Houston was already a big city, but by the end of the 1970s, it would become something else entirely, something louder, richer, taller, and more conflicted. A city where fortunes were made and lost in a year, where schools fought over integration even as companies carved glass monoliths into the clouds, where cultures collided in grocery stores and on freeway shoulders, where the sky itself sometimes looked like it was on fire, flaring gas from the ship channel lighting the night orange. It was an era of contradiction, of motion, of tension, and it began with oil. In the early years of the decade, Houston was a port city with skyscraper dreams. The city's skyline was low and wide, still dominated by the dome of the Astrodome and the shadows of mid-century office buildings. But then the price of oil, black gold, as Texans like to call it, began to rise, and rise, and rise. By 1973, when the Arab oil embargo sent shockwaves across the globe, Houston was uniquely positioned. It was the beating heart of the American energy industry. Major players, Exxon, Shell, Gulf, Texaco, already had offices here. Pipelines radiated from the city like veins. Tankers lined up in the ship channel. Natural gas fields pulsed beneath the nearby countryside. And suddenly, there was money. So much money. Office towers sprang up like stalks after rain. The city's skyline, once modest and horizontal, shot upward. One Shell Plaza opened in 1971, a white-clad column of glass and steel that reigned as the tallest building in Houston. Just a few years later, other giants followed. Texas Commerce Tower, Allied Bank Plaza, and eventually, by the end of the decade, the Transco Tower, which would cast its long shadow over the Galleria. It wasn't just downtown. The west side of Houston, particularly along what would soon be known as the Energy Corridor, saw an eruption of corporate campuses. Executives in pastel shirts and gold watches commuted in shiny Lincolns down freshly paved highways. Engineers worked in brand new cubicles with shag carpet and ergonomic chairs. Office parks with names like Park 10 and Energy Plaza sprouted beside bayous and creeks. And the housing followed. Subdivisions unfurled like ribbons westward. Memorial, West Chase, Briar Forest. Developers offered deals on sprawling ranch homes with large lots and central air. Every home came with a 2-car garage, a backyard, and the promise of comfort just far enough from the noise of downtown. But not everyone was invited. While white families embraced the promise of the suburbs, black and Latino Houstonians were often left behind, caught in neighborhoods that the city's rapid expansion seemed to skip. The older wards, 3rd, 4th, 5th, still held tight to their histories, but services were scarce. Roads crumbled. Schools were underfunded. The smell of industrial runoff lingered in the air. And then came the busying. In 1970, a federal judge ordered the desegregation of the Houston Independent School District. The plan, like many across the country, relied heavily on forced busying, moving students across town to achieve racial balance. Black students were boozed from Third Ward to mostly white schools in southwest Houston. White students were boozed in the other direction. The response was swift and divisive. Some white families pulled their children from public schools entirely, enrolling them in private academies or moving to independent suburban districts like Spring Branch and Clear Creek. Others protested at school board meetings, carrying signs and chanting slogans about neighborhood schools. Black families, for their part, had mixed feelings. Many supported integration in principle, but worried their children were being sent to schools where they would face hostility, and not always receive the same support they got at home. The city tried to compromise. Magnet programs were created. Specialized schools for science, performing arts, and language were launched in an effort to attract voluntary integration. Some succeeded. Others remained segregated in all but name. Still, in the classrooms and lunchrooms, the lines began to shift. Slowly, awkwardly, young Houstonians sat beside peers they'd once been taught to fear, and in that quiet daily exposure, something began to change. Elsewhere, political corruption made its way to the headlines. In 1971, a scandal erupted that would rattle Texas politics, and Houston was at its heart. It was called the Sharpstown Scandal, named for developer Frank Sharp, who had orchestrated a scheme involving state officials, stock manipulation, and favors. Sharp had close ties to the state legislature, and when the plot was exposed, several politicians were indicted. Though it was a statewide scandal, its tremors were felt deeply in Houston. Voters, angry at the old guard, demanded reform. New leaders emerged, some younger, some more progressive. The city council began to shift, though slowly, and in the background, grassroots movements among Black, Latino, and Asian communities began to gain strength. In 1973, the city held elections for city council seats using a new structure, 9 district seats instead of at-large positions. This opened the door for true neighborhood representation. That year, Leonel Castillo became the first Latino elected to citywide office as city controller. Just a few years later, Mickey Leland, a charismatic young Black leader, would rise from community activism to the state legislature and later to Congress. These were the new voices of Houston, young, diverse, deeply rooted in their communities. And yet, the old challenges lingered. The city's growth outpaced its planning. Traffic snarled on the freeways. Air pollution worsened as smog from refineries and car exhaust thickened the sky. Flooding remained a constant threat. Bayous overflowed during spring rains, and low-lying neighborhoods were regularly submerged. The city had no zoning laws, and while that encouraged flexibility and speed, it also led to chaotic development. Chemical plants stood near homes. Strip malls sprang up across from schools. There was no logic, only momentum. Still, many residents embraced the chaos. It was the price of freedom, they said, of prosperity. And there was prosperity for some. In 1976, the city celebrated the United States bicentennial with fireworks over Herman Park. Parades marched down Main Street. Schoolchildren sang patriotic songs beneath banners of red, white, and blue. It was a moment of shared identity even if not all felt equally included. That same year, the Astrodome hosted not just baseball, but rock concerts, rodeos, and even boxing matches. The city's cultural life was expanding. The Houston Grand Opera earned national acclaim. The Menil family began laying plans for a major art collection. Restaurants multiplied, serving everything from Tex-Mex to soul food to the Vietnamese pho. Because as oil brought money, it also brought people. Houston in the 1970s was becoming one of the most international cities in America. Immigrants arrived from Vietnam, India, Nigeria, Iran, and beyond, drawn by jobs, by opportunity, by the sheer openness of the place. Entire communities took root. Little Saigon emerged along Belair Boulevard. African grocery stores opened on Bissonnet. Mosques and temples joined the city's skyline beside steeples and spires. It was messy, vibrant, and deeply human. The decade closed with a strange mix of exhaustion and expectation. The oil money still flowed, but the peaks were visible. The sky was filled with more towers, more cranes, more dreams, but also more questions. Who was Houston for? Where was it going? And could it keep growing without breaking? On quiet nights, the Bayous still moved beneath the city, carrying runoff, reflection, and the memory of old paths. Above them, the towers glowed. In neighborhoods across town, families turned off televisions, flipped on ceiling fans, and drifted into sleep beneath the constant hum of a city that never stopped changing. This was Houston in the 1970s, a city on fire, with growth, with energy, with tension, with hope. Tomorrow would bring more, and the streets would still be warm. Houston entered the 1980s like a rocket taking off. Fast, loud, burning bright. At the dawn of the decade, the city stood taller than it ever had. The skyline shimmered in mirrored glass and steel. Cranes dotted the horizon. The energy sector was flush with wealth. New high-rises emerged seemingly overnight, each more ambitious than the last. And the spirit of the city was optimistic, driven, relentless. This was the Sunbelt ascendant, and Houston was at its heart, the oil capital of the free world. The air buzzed with confidence. In Galleria boardrooms and energy corridor office parks, executives signed deals worth hundreds of millions. Real estate developers poured concrete like water. Banks handed out loans with a handshake. It was a time of limitless promise, or so it seemed. But beneath that shimmering surface, cracks were forming. The oil industry, which had fueled Houston's explosive growth, was always a double-edged sword. When global oil prices were high, the city thrived. But oil was a volatile master. In the early years of the 1980s, oil prices soared, topping $35 per barrel. Office towers filled. Restaurants boomed. Suburban shopping malls expanded. New neighborhoods stretched out toward Katy, Kingwood, and Sugarland, where oak trees still stood in fields of tall grass. Then, almost without warning, it all began to collapse. In 1982, the bottom started to fall out. The global market shifted. A worldwide glut, falling demand, and geopolitical changes caused prices to plunge. By 1986, oil was selling for less than $10 a barrel. Houston, which had built its identity on black gold, suddenly found itself in freefall. The impact was swift and brutal. Office vacancies skyrocketed. Nearly 1 in 5 downtown buildings stood empty. Developers abandoned half-finished skyscrapers. The banking sector, so deeply tied to real estate and oil, buckled under the weight. From 1982 to 1987, more than a dozen Houston banks failed, including some of the largest regional lenders. Foreclosures multiplied. Families left homes behind. For sale signs lined streets, once bustling with optimism. Unemployment soared. At its peak, nearly 1 in 9 Houstonians were out of work. Engineers pumped gas. Former executives bagged groceries. People downsized, sold second cars, delayed retirement. The city had once overflowed with growth, now whispered with anxiety. But even amid hardship, life went on. Children went to school. Churches offered food pantries and job boards. Music played from car stereos on Westheimer. People adapted. They always had. In 1981, Catherine J. Whitmire was elected mayor, Houston's first female mayor and a figure of calm resolve. A Democrat in a largely conservative city, Whitmire focused on stabilizing city finances, modernizing services, and guiding Houston through the storm. Her leadership, pragmatic and focused, helped Houston avoid deeper collapse. During the downturn, one symbol of resilience stood tall above all others, the Transco Tower. Completed in 1983, it rose 64 stories into the sky, the tallest building in Houston at the time and still the tallest structure in Texas outside Dallas. Its clean lines and beacon-like floodlight at the top made it a landmark on the western horizon. But its opening also marked the turning point. As the tower gleamed, the economy crumbled. And yet, not all was loss. In the same years that the oil market shrank, Houston's cultural identity began to widen. The Houston Grand Opera staged ambitious new productions, winning national acclaim. The Museum of Fine Arts expanded its galleries. The Alley Theatre, Jones Hall, and Wortham Center anchored a growing theatre district that gave the city cultural depth to match its economic ambitions. The Menil Collection, quietly organized by the reclusive but visionary Dominique and John de Menil, prepared to open a world-class art museum in Montrose. Montrose itself, once a quiet residential neighborhood, had become the city's beating creative heart, home to artists, musicians, poets, and the emerging LGBTQ+ community. Bars, bookstores, and studios clustered around Westheimer, drawing a mix of bohemian youth and longtime residents. The neighborhood pulsed with color, contrast, and conversation. But it was also a place of mourning. In the mid-1980s, the AIDS epidemic hit Houston hard. Montrose became one of the centers of crisis and compassion. Activists, healthcare workers, and everyday citizens organized food drives, medical support, and quiet vigils. In the face of fear, the community leaned into empathy. Names were remembered. Lives were honored. Love, often hidden, took visible form. Elsewhere, racial and political shifts continued. In 1983, African-American politician Larry Green won a city council seat. By the mid-1980s, Black and Latino representation on the council was growing steadily. In schools, integration continued, though disparities remained. In neighborhoods like Sunnyside, Fifth Ward, and Denver Harbor, residents still faced underfunding and limited services, but voices grew stronger. In 1984, Congressman Mickey Leland, a charismatic and compassionate figure, led hunger relief efforts in Africa and in Houston's underserved communities. His work became nationally recognized. His face, smiling, firm, hopeful, came to symbolize a new generation of Houston leadership. His untimely death in a 1989 plane crash during a relief mission to Ethiopia left the city mourning, united across divisions. The 1980s also brought environmental reckoning. Years of industrial growth had left scars. The ship channel, once a marvel of commerce, had become one of the most polluted waterways in the country. Smog alerts blanketed the summers. The Bayous, those ancient veins of the city, swelled with runoff and chemical byproduct. In 1988, a series of plant explosions, most notably at the Phillips 66 plant in Pasadena, reminded the city how thin the line was between progress and disaster. Regulation came slowly, but it came. Citizen groups organized. City leaders pressed for reform. The first seeds of the green movement in Houston took root, not in leafy enclaves, but in working-class neighborhoods where pollution hit hardest. Even in hardship, Houston looked forward. New immigrants arrived, reshaping the city's fabric. Vietnamese, Salvadoran, Nigerian, Indian, and Chinese communities grew rapidly, settling in southwest and west Houston. Markets, restaurants, and community centers reflected this shift. The city's once Anglo-dominated cultural landscape began to take on a deeper, more global tone. By 1989, as the decade drew to a close, Houston was no longer the city it had been in 1980. It was sobered, but not defeated. Smaller in ego, but broader in scope. More reflective, more diverse, more cautious, but still full of energy, if not in barrels, then in people. The towers still stood, some empty, some full. The Bayous still wound through the landscape, silent and ancient. And in the neighborhoods, life continued, not as a boom, but as a rhythm. Houston, like the oil it depended on, had been pressurized, and like oil, it had transformed under heat and time. It had learned, it had changed, and it would rise again. By the time the 1990s arrived, Houston had learned something most cities take generations to understand: how to lose and how to keep going. The oil bust of the previous decade had left scars, some deep, some still raw. There were empty buildings downtown, forgotten subdivisions outside the loop, and a certain wariness behind the eyes of those who had once flown high on petroleum dreams. But under the surface, something else had begun to stir. Not a boom, not yet, but a quiet recalibration. The towers still stood, but now they reflected something more than just ambition. They mirrored a city slowly finding a new rhythm, more balanced, more diverse, more resilient. Houston in the 1990s was a city mending its pulse and widening its arms. The decade opened with growth, not the reckless, unzoned sprint of the 1970s, but a more thoughtful kind, measured, intentional. The population was rising again, crossing the 1.6 million mark within the city and more than 4 million across the metro. New industries were taking root: healthcare, logistics, international trade, and engineering. The oil giants remained, of course. They always would. But their dominance was no longer complete. Houston was becoming something else, global. Walk the streets of Sharpstown or Gulfton, and you'd hear Spanish, Vietnamese, Urdu, Mandarin. Grocery stores began stocking plantains, halal meats, soy sauces, and cassava. Along Hillcroft Avenue, Indian and Pakistani restaurants stood beside Salvadoran pupuserias and Iranian bakeries. What had once been a sprawling car-choked southern oil town had quietly become one of the most ethnically diverse cities in America, and it happened not with great fanfare, but with daily life. Neighbors borrowing sugar, kids trading lunches, churches and temples rising beside one another. By the mid-1990s, over 80 different languages was spoken in Houston schools. Classrooms buzzed with a mix of accents and histories, each child carrying a story their grandparents might never have dreamed of. The Houston Independent School District, once a battleground for boozing and desegregation, now wrestled with how to teach science to 6-year-olds who spoke no English but knew the stars above their homes in Cambodia or Colombia. At the same time, the city found something it hadn't truly felt in years: joy. In 1994, the Houston Rockets, long considered good but not great, made a run for the NBA championship. Led by the soft-spoken and towering Hakeem Olajuwon, a Nigerian-born center with ballet-like footwork and a heart as steady as the Gulf, the team stunned the country. They swept past Portland, Phoenix, and finally New York to claim the title. The city erupted. Parades filled downtown streets. Strangers hugged on sidewalks. It wasn't just a sports victory. It was something more. A reminder that Houston could win, could unite, could stand up on the national stage and smile. And then, in 1995, they did it again. Back-to-back champions. The city, once uncertain of its post-oil identity, rediscovered its voice, in cheers echoing from apartment windows, in Olajuwon's elegant moves on court, in the purple and red jerseys worn by kids in every neighborhood. This was Houston. Multilingual, muscular, graceful, proud. Beyond the court, the city was growing smarter. The Texas Medical Center continued to expand, becoming the largest such complex in the world. Research institutions partnered with private hospitals. Medical breakthroughs trickled from lab to clinic. The University of Houston, once a quiet commuter school, grew into a dynamic research institution with international ties. At Rice University, new centers for urban policy and public health opened their doors. The city's colleges and community colleges adapted, offering ESL classes, job training, and degrees tailored to the city's evolving workforce. And still, the city sprawled. Freeways widened. The West Loop, always choked with cars, became a monument to the limits of automotive freedom. Outside the Beltway, developers carved new subdivisions into prairie and pine. Cypress, Katy, the woodlands. They grew like vines across old farmland, their names carefully chosen to sound natural and safe. With that growth came debate. In 1991, the city of Hyo-Stun annexed Kingwood, a large planned community to the northeast. Residents protested. They had chosen to live outside city limits, enjoying lower taxes and fewer regulations. But Hyo-Stun, always eager to expand its boundaries and tax base, brought them in. Lawsuits followed. Signs appeared. Free Kingwood. The city had flexed its annexation powers before, but rarely had the pushback been so visible. Yet annexation was essential to Hyo-Stun's model. With no zoning laws and no natural geographic barriers, the city had always expanded outward, absorbing land, services, problems, and people. It was how it stayed alive. Inside the loop, another kind of rebirth began. In Midtown, long a forgotten stretch of empty lots and crumbling warehouses, developers saw potential. Artists moved in. Small music venues opened their doors. By decade's end, Midtown would be on the rise. Montrose, always a countercultural hub, bloomed with galleries and cafes. The Heights, with its bungalows and porch swings, quietly gentrified. The arts followed suit. In 1997, the Menil Collection, already a gem of modern art, opened its Cy Twombly Gallery, drawing international attention. The Museum of Fine Arts expanded. The Alley Theatre staged bold new works. H.W.O.Stun Symphony filled Jones Hall. The city's cultural scene was no longer just regional, it was respected. Politically, the city was changing too. In 1997, Lee P. Brown was elected mayor, the first African American to hold the office. A former police chief and federal drug czar, Brown ran on a platform of inclusion, infrastructure, and public safety. His victory marked a turning point. The city's leadership now reflected the demographics of its people. City council diversified. More women, more Latinos, more Asian Americans. Representation mattered. And in community centers and churches across town, children began to believe that the city was theirs too, not just to live in, but to shape. But all was not harmony. Flooding remained a constant threat. Every spring, heavy rains overwhelmed Bayous and storm drains. Some neighborhoods flooded again and again. Developers built in low-lying areas, often ignoring environmental risks. The city, always reactive, struggled to catch up. And then there was traffic. With over 4 million in the metro area, H.Y.O.Stun's love affair with the car became a source of daily frustration. Commutes lengthened. Accidents multiplied. Smog thickened. Debates flared over rail transit. A proposed monorail was voted down. NITI tried to expand bus service, but ridership declined. The city, vast and flat, resisted easy answers. Still, the decade felt like healing. Compared to the shock of the 1980s, the 1990s were smoother, steadier. The scars remained, but they were no longer fresh. H.W.O.Stun had matured. It had learned to bend without breaking. It had learned that strength wasn't just in money, but in people. Immigrants, nurses, janitors, engineers, teachers, artists. The century was ending. Y2K loomed on the horizon. The computers, they said, might crash. Planes might fall from the sky. But Houstonians, used to storms and market crashes, shrugged. They stocked bottled water, sure. But they also made plans. They looked forward. The skyline glittered. The ship channel steamed. The Bayous flowed, quiet and brown. And the city, loud, sprawling, kind, and restless, carried itself into the next century, not with fanfare, but with a calm, confident step. This was the H.W.O.Stun of the 1990s, rooted in recovery, alive with diversity, building a future one freeway at a time. A new millennium, a new century, a new chapter. As the clocks struck midnight on January 1st, 2000, H.W.O.Stun stood under fireworks, bright against the humid night sky. The fears of Y2K flickered away like old static. Computers did not crash. Planes did not fall. The world, it seemed, had exhaled. And the city, long weathered by storms both economic and literal, prepared to step forward into the unknown with that familiar blend of swagger, resilience, and southern grace. The skyline had never looked better. Towers gleamed in silver and glass. The streets downtown, once ghostly after dark, now stirred with life. Restaurants, nightclubs, cafes, and art spaces opened in buildings that had sat empty a decade before. It was a renaissance, modest but sure, and people felt it. You could see it in the joggers in Buffalo Bay Park, in the new lofts carved out of old warehouses in Midtown, in the fresh murals blooming on brick in the Heights. There was energy again, not just oil but human. The city's demographics were changing too. By 2000, H.W.O.Stun was officially a majority-minority city. No single racial or ethnic group held a majority. Latino, Black, White, Asian, Arab, and African communities all lived side by side, sometimes easily, sometimes uneasily, but undeniably shaping one another. This was no longer a southern city, or even just a Texan one. It was global, a port city, a refugee city, a place of arrivals and reinvention. And then, as if to remind HYO Stun that change is never linear, 2001 arrived, and brought both triumph and disaster. In April, Enron was flying high. The energy company, once a regional player, had become a global powerhouse. Its sleek towers in downtown HYO Stun stood like emblems of innovation. Executives were hailed as visionaries. Stock soared. The company had its name on stadiums, concert halls, and charities. But beneath the surface, something was rotting. By December, Enron was bankrupt. Its collapse was swift, stunning, and seismic. Over 20,000 employees lost their jobs. Pensions vanished. Retirements evaporated. The public, watching from home, felt a cold punch of betrayal. Investigations followed. Trials. Perp walks in designer suits. The phrase "cooking the books" became national shorthand, and HYO Stun, suddenly synonymous with the scandal, bore the shame. But even as the fallout settled, the city kept moving. In the very same year, another symbol of renewal opened its doors. Minute Maid Park, home of the HYO Stun Astros. The old dome was history. This was baseball under a retractable roof with sunlight and skyline views. The team was competitive. Families returned at downtown for games, hot dogs, and night strolls beneath string lights. The city was remembering itself. 2 years later, another promise took form in steel, the MET or rail. For decades, HYO Stun had debated mass transit. Voters had rejected rail again and again. But in 2004, a light rail line finally opened, stretching from the University of HYO Stun downtown to Reliant Park. It was short, it was slow, but it was a beginning, a quiet rebuke to the city's car-first past. Then came 2005. The summer was long and hot. Thunderstorms brewed and passed. Then, in late August, the news broke Hurricane Katrina had struck Louisiana, and New Orleans was drowning. Overnight, tens of thousands fled westward. Cars packed with suitcases, family heirlooms, and exhausted children streamed down I-10. And when they arrived in HYO Stun, the city opened its arms. In just days, the Astrodome, that aging monument to mid-century wonder, was transformed into a shelter for over 25,000 evacuees. Cots lined the concourses. Volunteers brought water, food, soap, kindness. Churches opened basements. Schools enrolled displaced children. Barbers offered free haircuts. Doctors offered free care. The city did not blink. It embraced. It was one of HYO Stun's finest moments, not because of perfect coordination or planning, but because of its people. Everyday citizens from every corner of the city came together without hesitation. It was messy. It was human. It was beautiful. And then, less than a month later, Hurricane Rita came barreling toward Texas. Fear set in. Memories of Katrina were fresh. The evacuation was massive. Over 3 million people tried to leave the Gulf Coast at once. Highways became parking lots. Cars ran out of gas. Some people died from heat and stress before the storm ever arrived. When it finally did, Rita shifted east, sparing HYO Stun the worst. But the trauma lingered. Evacuation plans were rewritten. Families stocked supplies differently. Everyone remembered. In the years that followed, the city refocused on its infrastructure. Flood control projects were revisited, emergency protocols revised. The Bayous, so often ignored, was studied again. Nature had not finished with HYO stun, and wouldn't for years to come. But still, life pulsed forward. New neighborhoods bloomed outside the Beltway. Pearland, Cypress, and the woodlands swelled with families, many first-generation Americans, building lives with mortgages, minivans, and dreams of better. Schools opened in modular units, unable to keep pace. Football fields filled on Friday nights. Grocery stores began stocking tamarind, turmeric, and tahini. In 2007, HWO stun reached a new milestone. Over 2 million residents within the city limits and nearly 6 million across the metro. And yet it remained unzoned. Developers could still place an apartment complex beside a tattoo parlor, beside a church, beside a strip club. The chaos, by now, was part of the identity. It wasn't always elegant, but it was honest. The city grew how it wanted, and somehow it worked. That same year, HYO Stun elected Bill White to a second term as mayor. A pragmatic Democrat, White was popular across party lines. He emphasized flood prevention, disaster response, and public-private partnerships. Under his tenure, the city began to feel more cohesive, less like a patchwork, more like a quilt. And still, the skyline evolved. Downtown towers welcomed new tenants. The Toyota Center hosted concerts and basketball games. The Discovery Green Park, opened in 2008, gave Houstonians a downtown green space where families picnicked and kids danced through fountains. Art installations, farmers' markets, and outdoor yoga became part of the city's new language. But storms still came. In September 2008, Hurricane Ike rolled ashore with Category 2 winds and a massive storm surge. Galveston was battered. Parts of HYO Stun lost power for weeks. Trees toppled. Windows shattered. Streets flooded. The city, tested again, responded again. Neighbors helped neighbors. Chainsaws buzzed. Gas lines curled around blocks. And slowly the lights came back on. Ike reminded HYO Stun of its fragility. That water and wind would always be part of the story. That growth meant risk. That survival required memory. And so the decade closed with lessons, with pride, with scars, and with a strange kind of calm. The 2000s had given HYO Stun triumphs: rail, renewal, diversity, compassion. They had also delivered trials: fraud, flood, fire, and fear. But through it all, the city endured, not because it was perfect, because it was prepared to keep going, each time and always. The second decade of the new millennium began not with a boom or a crash, but with a hum. A steady, determined hum, the kind that fills a city when it's working, growing, trying to get better, not by leaps, but by steps. HYO Stun in 2010 wasn't reinventing itself. It was fortifying, maturing, laying new foundations in a world that felt fast and more crowded and more uncertain. The city had weathered Y2K, Enron, Rita, and Ike. Now it faced the slow weight of modernity, the pressure to adapt, the challenge to remain livable, the responsibility to carry forward millions of lives through a changing climate, an evolving economy, and the quiet, grinding work of equity and inclusion. It was a decade of steady progress, until the water came. But before that, there was movement and hope. In 2010, Anais Parker, a soft-spoken, detail-driven policy expert, became HYOO Stun's mayor. The national press focused on one fact: she was the first openly gay mayor of a major American city. But inside HYOO Stun, people talked more about drainage, pension reform, potholes, and balanced budgets. Parker served 3 terms: pragmatic, calm, and quietly historic. Under her leadership, the city expanded green space. The Bayou Greenways Initiative began stitching together 150 miles of trails along HYOO Stun's winding waterways: Buffalo Bayou, Braes, Sims, and White Oak. Parks bloomed where drainage ditches had once dominated. Cyclists and joggers discovered views of the city they'd never seen: reflections of glass towers in slow-moving water, herons lifting off from marshes at dusk. Elsewhere, the Texas Medical Center expanded again. By the mid-2010s, it employed over 100,000 people, a city within a city, where doctors and researchers quietly pushed the boundaries of science and compassion. The buildings climbed higher, the breakthroughs ran deeper, and patients flew in from across the globe. The city's population kept growing. By 2015, HYOO Stun passed 2.2 million residents. Greater HYOO Stun topped 6 million. Immigrants continued to arrive from Honduras, from Syria, from Nigeria, from China, from Haiti. The city's diversity deepened not just in numbers, but in neighborhoods, in restaurants, in places of worship. Hillcroft became the Mahatma Gandhi district, lined with Indian grocers, Pakistani tailors, Afghan bakeries, and Filipino cafes. Belair Boulevard stretched from Chinatown in the east through Little Saigon and into the Latin American markets of Alif. Richmond Avenue buzzed with Ethiopian Indra shops and West African hair salons. This was the global city, not in theory, but in form. You could hear it on the Nichiro bus, in waiting rooms, in barbershops, in corner stores. HYOO Stun wasn't just multi-ethnic. It was multilingual, polycultural, and somehow, beautifully, held together. And then, in late August 2017, the rain came. At first, it was just a forecast. Then a warning. Then a wall of water that would not stop falling. Hurricane Harvey made landfall on August 25 as a Category 4 storm near Rockport. But it wasn't the wind that made it infamous. It was the rain, relentless, biblical, nearly incomprehensible. Over 4 days, Harvey dropped more than 50 inches on parts of the HYOO Stun area. That's 4 feet of water from the sky in less than a week. The city had flooded before. Everyone remembered Allison. Everyone remembered Ike. But this was different. This was everywhere. Creeks became rivers. Bayous became oceans. Freeways disappeared beneath chocolate-colored currents. Whole subdivisions became islands, then lakes. Homes filled, first with inches, then with feet. Bedrooms, memories, photo albums, and baby books, all gone. More than 300,000 structures were flooded. Nearly 40,000 people were forced into shelters. Dozens died. Tens of billions in damage. It was, by some measures, the most devastating rainstorm in U.S. history. But HYOO Stun did what HYOO Stun always does. It moved. It helped. It didn't wait. Boats launched from front yards. Neighbors formed human chains to pull people from rising waters. Churches opened doors. Mosques cooked meals. Synagogues handed out diapers and cleaning supplies. Mattress Mac, a furniture store owner, opened his showroom as a shelter. People slept on couches and in recliners while the storm raged outside. Volunteers came from everywhere, Cajun Navy boats from Louisiana, food trucks, nurses, teenagers in kayaks, grandmothers with pots of gumbo. It wasn't organized. It was organic. And it was breathtaking. No one waited for permission. They just showed up. And when the rain finally stopped, when the sun emerged and the air turned hot and thick again, H.Y.O. Stun looked around at the wreckage and began to clean. Mold boomed in the walls. Drywall was ripped out by hand. The sound of hammers and chainsaws echoed for months. People rebuilt, slowly, together. The storm revealed truths. It showed where the flood maps had failed. It exposed the consequences of unchecked development in low-lying areas. It reignited debates about zoning, infrastructure, equity. Some neighborhoods flooded every few years. Others had never flooded until now. In my land, in Kashmir Gardens, in Bear Creek, people asked, should we rebuild? Can we rebuild? Will anyone help? In the years that followed, the answers came slowly. Buyouts began. Flood tunnels were proposed. Reservoirs studied. Watershed maps redrawn. FEMA money trickled in. But the emotional toll remained high, because Harvey wasn't just a storm. It was a reckoning. And yet, amid all of this, the grief, the loss, the bureaucracy, H.Y.O. Stun didn't crumble. It adapted. New building codes were passed. Home elevations became common. Volunteers turned into community leaders. Non-profits formed. Neighbors who had once never spoken now knew one another by name. The city wasn't the same. It never would be. But it was stronger. In the years after Harvey, H.Y.O. Stun also saw new light. In 2017, the H.Y.O. Stun Astros won their first World Series. The timing felt cosmic, a moment of shared joy just months after shared trauma. Downtown streets filled with fans, orange shirts, flags, laughter. The dome of sky that had so recently poured water now echoed with cheers. Some said it was a miracle. Others called it therapy. Either way, it mattered. By 2019, H.Y.O. Stun was once again redefining itself. A new generation of leaders emerged, younger, more diverse, more focused on equity, on climate, on sustainability. The city expanded bike lanes. More buses ran on time. Walkable neighborhoods gained ground. The art scene blossomed. Museums opened new wings. International food festivals packed parks. And quietly, behind the headlines, the city's soul continued to expand. A Vietnamese grandmother taught her grandson how to make bin haxio on a Sunday morning. A Nigerian Uber driver helped a family rescue furniture from a flooded garage. A Syrian baker donated 200 loaves of bread to a church shelter. A fourth-grade teacher in Alif taught ESL to a class with 9 different native languages. And the Bayous, once feared, became pathways again. The green trails stretched farther. The waters ran calmer. And the people, always, kept moving. The decade began with a murmur, a whisper of unease far away. Distant headlines, an unfamiliar word, coronavirus. In early 2020, life in H.Y.O. Stun continued more or less as normal. Traffic on I-45 still snarled at rush hour. Restaurants filled with the clink of glass and laughter. Students crammed for exams. Grandmothers baked kolaches in kitchens across the East End. People talked about politics, about potholes, about the humidity that never quite went away. But by March, everything had changed. One by one, the doors shut, schools closed, offices emptied, the roar of the city dulled to a hush. The sound of HYO stun, a symphony of jackhammers, car horns, sirens, leaf blowers, and conversation, was replaced by something unfamiliar. Silence. COVID-19 had arrived, and for the first time in living memory, HYO stun locked itself in. Downtown went still. The towers stood, but their windows were dark. Buses ran nearly empty. Restaurants shuttered. Theatres fell silent. Streets once bursting with life now echoed only the click of a lone jogger's shoes. At home, families gathered, not for celebration, but for safety. Living rooms became classrooms. Bedrooms became offices. Kitchens became conference rooms. Everyone adapted, as best they could. Some with patience, some with fear, some with grief. Hospitals filled. At the Texas Medical Center, the largest of its kind in the world, doctors and nurses donned layers of gear and walked into rooms filled with machines, beeping, coughing, silence. They worked 12-hour shifts, then 14, then more. They held phones up to patients' faces so families could say goodbye. The numbers grew. Cases, deaths, uncertainty. By summer, the masks were everywhere. On children, on bus drivers, on nurses and grocery clerks and delivery drivers. People learned to smile with their eyes. They stood 6 feet apart. They washed their hands until their skin cracked. They waited, and still, the city moved. It moved quietly, carefully, but always. Food pantries expanded. Neighbors checked on neighbors. Drive-through testing sites popped up in church parking lots. Kids learned how to say Zoom link and mute button before they learned fractions. Musicians streamed concerts from their bedrooms. Couples held weddings in backyards with 10 guests and a laptop. The pandemic didn't flatten HYO stun's spirit. It compressed it, concentrated it. In 2021, vaccines arrived. Relief came not in a sudden burst, but in cautious trickles. A nurse at Memorial Hermann giving the first dose. A grandmother crying in her car after getting hers. Hugs returned slowly. Elbows became handshakes again. Front porches filled with friends. Parks echoed with laughter. Not all at once, but it came. And just as the city began to stretch back into itself, the freeze hit. In February of 2021, a winter storm unlike any in living memory swept across Texas. HYO stun, built for heat and rain, was unprepared. Pipes froze. Power failed. Water stopped flowing. Temperatures plunged into the teens. Vesicles formed inside homes. People huddled beneath blankets, burned furniture for warmth, melted snow to flush toilets. Traffic lights blinked out. Grocery shelves emptied. Lines for bottled water curled around parking lots. Hospitals, already strained from COVID, now faced burst pipes and icy corridors. Apartment ceilings collapsed. Seniors froze in their sleep. The silence returned, this time from ice. But once again, the people of HYO stun answered. Friends took in friends. Churches opened their doors. Plumbers worked day and night. Strangers left cases of water on porches. Mutual aid groups spread faster than official help. People shared blankets, matches, cans of beans. In the dark, they found one another. The storm passed. The damage remained. But so did the memory of how fragile the systems were. of how quickly comfort could vanish, of how deeply people could care for one another when it mattered. By the end of 2021, Houston had been transformed, not by construction or politics or commerce, but by endurance. It was a quieter kind of change, internal, human. The city looked the same on a map, but inside its homes, schools, churches and stores, something had shifted. People knew now how fast life could halt. They knew how to help, and they knew how much they needed each other. By 2022, Houston had become a city that remembered. It remembered the floods, the freezes, the silence of lockdown. It remembered how close things had come to breaking, and how, again and again, it had bent instead. And in that remembering, something new took hold, not just survival, but design. Not just rebuilding, but reimagining. The city had always grown fast, but now it began to grow differently. Every conversation about housing, transit, infrastructure, energy began with a new question: how do we make this city last? It was not just policy, it was a shift in mood. You could feel it on the Bayou trails, where the air now carried the sound of bicycles, children and birdsong. The Bayou greenways, once a vision, had become a reality, linking neighborhoods long separated by concrete and freeway with green threads of walkability, bikeability and rest. People walked the same paths where floodwaters had once surged, and they walked not in fear, but in reflection. The word resilience became a guiding principle. It meant more than just bouncing back. It meant building smarter, stronger, softer where needed, harder where necessary. City planners talked about sponge cities and bioswales. Homeowners elevated. Developers paused to study floodplains. Residents questioned where and how Houston should continue to grow. At the same time, a quieter crisis unfolded. Housing. The city had always offered space, sprawling, cheap, accessible. But in these years, affordability began to slip. Rents rose. First-time buyers found themselves priced out. Entire communities, long rooted in places like Independence Heights, near North Side and Gulfton, began to feel squeezed by rising costs and outside investment. And so the city had to ask itself, who is Houston for? For developers? For newcomers? For the people who had kept it alive through the hard times? The answer wasn't clear, but the questions wouldn't go away. In the political sphere, new faces emerged, younger, more diverse, more focused on equity. Some were children of immigrants, some were scientists, some were activists who had organized flood recovery or pandemic mutual aid. Now, they ran for city council and won. They brought new ideas about housing cooperatives, renter protections, urban heat mapping, and green infrastructure. They didn't just want to manage the city, they wanted to heal it. And Houston listened. Not always quickly, not always quietly, but it listened. Elsewhere, the Texas Medical Center continued to stretch upward and outward, its research towers, hospitals, and biotech labs humming with discovery. Advances in cancer treatment, artificial organs, and pandemic prevention all emerged from these blocks of concrete and glass. The world kept watching Houston, not for oil this time, but for life. In energy, too, the city evolved. Hydrogen, carbon capture, wind and solar investment. What had been dismissed as peripheral now became central. Houston, still the energy capital, began to look beyond the pump. It asked how a city born in oil could lead a world that might someday live without it. It was not a revolution, but it was a turning. In 2023, the city marked its 187th birthday. There were speeches, of course, parades, fireworks. But the real celebration happened in places less formal, in a Honduran cafe in Gulfton, where 3 generations gathered over belidas and laughter. In a Montrose tattoo shop where a Syrian artist inked a Bayou onto a local teacher's arm. In a pop-up park in the Fifth Ward where a mariachi band played for a mixed crowd of elders and toddlers and friends who had once been strangers. The city pulsed with its own rhythm, polyphonic, imperfect, alive. Houston was still vast, still complex, still chaotic. But something had changed. It knew now what mattered, what lasted, what could be swept away, and what had to be protected. The Bayous still flowed, brown and slow, winding through old neighborhoods and new developments. They carried memory, runoff, reflection. And above them, the city moved, not just forward, but inward, toward understanding, toward care, toward something more rooted than the sprawl that had defined it for so long. By 2024, there were no illusions. Another flood would come. Another storm, another challenge. But now, Houston faced them with eyes open, with tools sharpened, with neighbors who knew one another's names. It was still a city of contradictions. But now, more than ever, it was a city of intention. If you stand on the banks of Buffalo Bayou at dawn, you can feel it. That hum beneath the concrete, that slow, patient rhythm of water moving through memory, the rustle of leaves, the groan of traffic waking up, the skyline blowing, not yet sharp, as sunlight seeps across steel and glass. This is Houston at its quietest, its most honest, its most whole. It is not a city that shouts. It doesn't drape itself in marble. It doesn't demand to be seen. Houston, for all its scale, remains strangely private. A city of neighborhoods, of back doors, of long commutes and short phone calls. It reveals itself slowly and only to those willing to look beneath the surface. And what you find there, if you take your time, is astonishing. Because this city is not one story. It is 1,000, 1,000,000. Each house on every street holds a different beginning, a different tone. Some loud, some quiet, some bitter, some redemptive, some still unfinished. And that, maybe more than anything, is what gives Houston its depth. It is never complete. From the start, it was a place shaped by water, by marsh, by bayou. It rose not from a port or a hilltop or a colonial square, but from the edge of a murky river and a dream scribbled by 2 brothers with more ambition than certainty. And yet it endured. It grew. It failed. It rebuilt. It failed again. Yellow fever, floods, fire, war, inequality, segregation, loon bust, water, again and again. But it never stopped growing, not just outward, but inward. It absorbed waves of people from around the world. It stitched them into its fabric. It did not always welcome them easily, or fairly, or kindly, but it made room. And those people, in turn, made Houston, the ones who arrived with nothing, the ones who rebuilt after the storm, the ones who held the city in place with their hands, their words, their silence. What does Houston mean? It means second chances. It means neighbors in boats pulling strangers from attics. It means pho and brisket and tacos al pastor, all on the same block. It means skyscrapers that glint in the sun and sweat-drenched afternoons spent patching drywall in houses that flooded 3 times in 5 years. It means not giving up. It means complexity without pretense. A city of oil and opera, of gospel and Gaelish, of silence and science and soft-spoken strength. It is not perfect. It never pretended to be. But there is something in its bones, deep beneath the parking lots and pipelines and power lines, something steady and warm and oddly human. Because Houston is not an idea, it's a feeling, a breath held during the storm, a sigh released when the sun returns, a hand extended across water, across language, across pain. It is a place where futures are built, not loudly but daily, brick by brick, word by word, in laughter, in loss, in labor. It's a place that believes in tomorrow, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. So if you ever find yourself here, really here, stay a while. Stand on the Bayou in the early light. Listen. Let the sound of it all, the water, the wind, the distant voice of a city waking up, settle into your chest. And know this: you're standing in the story of Houston, still being written, still becoming, still alive.